Welcome to my world, degenerates, degeneritas, and degenerati. This is the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 299, O'Malley versus Vera 2, live from Miami, Florida, and you are looking, well, not quite live, but finally the backdrop is on brand for the location, at least. You're not just going to be gazing out of my view this time without context. This is right down the street from the Kaseya Center where this pay-per-view will be taking place. It was about a year ago that I moved in here, and literally a couple days before UFC 287, and I had scored a ticket right on the rail, not quite on the floor, but on the rail, maybe 25 yards behind the commentary booth, and had a perfect vantage point for Adesanya versus Pereira 2, 3, whatever you want to call it, 4. One of the greatest, perhaps, endings to any rivalry in the history of combat sports. We'll see if we get another fight that would probably be at light heavyweight, but that's still depending on if Adesanya can reclaim his title. But enough not lamenting, but reflecting on the past, because we've got another rivalry taking place as the main title fight for a pay-per-view set to take place this week with Sugar Show and Chito. Oh, man. I'm looking forward to discussing all of these fights. But obviously I want to recap the last couple of events, just because there's three fights in particular that I want to address relative to mistakes made in picking favorites for UFC Mexico and UFC Vegas 87 last week. But really quick, before I do a quick recap on that, before we get into breaking down what I believe are 10 fights that I have graded for this upcoming pay-per-view, I feel obligated to address, maybe not obligated, but I do want to make a quick comment on a pretty significant event that took place within the last 24, 48 hours as I'm recording this, relative to the demise of one of the biggest pillars of MMA media in this space. And of course, I'm talking about Bloody Elbow. Now, I've made a point before that, as a budding brand myself, only, 2 years into this, I believe Bloody Elbow was founded in 2007, obviously with some help and assistance from SB Nation at that point. I, as a budding MMA media brand, I need to remind you to please follow on Twitter and like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. I need every little bit of assistance in gathering clout that I can get in the infancy of this stage, much in the way that Bloody Elbow once was. Although I'm not sure if they were ever, a purely one-man show, as yours truly still is at this point in the life cycle of the brand. But I've made a point before of saying that I'm never going to ask for your money, and I'm not going to sell out. I've already turned down sponsorships from sports books that were offered, as far back as over a year ago at this point. And I want to make that point today because what I saw from Bloody Elbow relative to how the site branded itself and its rebirth not even a year ago as this phoenix rising from the ashes of the Vox Media layoffs is really fucking pathetic behavior from Nate Wilcox, the site's original founder, who, although he didn't write the piece about how Bloody Elbow was saved himself, is very regularly illustrated in that piece as someone that put out a public cry for assistance when Bloody Elbow was going to be losing its support from Vox Media and needed assistance in building its own manageable front-end and back-end website that could then migrate all of the existing content from the SB Nation platform over to its new independent website. which is referenced in the article that is referenced for how Bloody Elbow was saved a year ago as Bloody Elbow 1.6, with the promise, or not necessarily promise, but the expectation thrust upon the tech team, as they're referenced in the article, a group of 6 people that Nate Wilcox says got paid for their efforts. So, good for them. I'm not sure if they would have built him such a sophisticated front end and back end product if they knew that less than a year later he was going to turn around and sell it to GRV Media that would then gut all of the content that the site had built its reputation on as distincting itself in the MMA space. All of the stuff about James Krause gambling controversy is gone. All of the content around the ongoing antitrust lawsuit, which could hold very, very significant ramifications in the near future for fighter pay and the monopoly that the UFC has cast over the entire MMA world, is gone. All of the subjects of controversy are gone. The Ian Kidd stuff relative to them harboring a child predator for 2 months after his conviction before showing him his walking papers is gone. All of the all of that has been stripped from the site even before the announcement of the sale went live today as I'm recording this on Tuesday. The notice became official Tuesday morning, but it's really sad to see the hypocrisy from the founder of Bloody Elbow as, it's so important for this site to go on and exist and be this, this voice in the MMA landscape where we're losing so much independent journalism. And I don't dispute that at all, in spite of the fact that many people are just outwardly critical and annoyed of the space that platform occupied relative to being, whatever political persuasions you may have, not necessarily aligned with what the traditional combat sports fan believes. So it's to complain about how the site lost its foothold with Vox Media as MMA Mania goes on to exist, as well as MMAfighting.com, and to then turn around a year later and betray the efforts of the people that were, putting themselves forward for the sake of and putting forth a labor of love, regardless of whether they got paid or not, to try to save this brand. For Nate Wilcox to then turn around and sell the site to GRV Media for the sake of recouping his own debts and just trying to save face, regardless of whether or not people are out of a job. The people that stuck around after the initial layoffs a year ago were completely betrayed today. And for him, Nate Wilcox, to do the same thing to the people that helped save that brand in the last year, and then blame the need to sail the site on poor SEO and say, the Google algorithm shift in the fall killed 50% of our traffic. Let me tell you something. As someone that's worked in SEO for multiple years, Google changes their algorithm all the time. SEO is a constantly adapting landscape. There's no way that one algorithm shift destroyed half of your revenue. And for you to hide behind that as the reason that you had to sail and gut this site, instead of whatever poor decision-making went on behind the scenes, is really fucking pathetic, and it's sad. And I'm going to reiterate this as someone that has told you before that for this platform, MMA Racks, I'm not going to sell out, that I am never going, regardless of whether I have people working under me in the near future for this platform, which would be a wonderful thing to see. I don't know if I would be able to pay them a livable wage for those efforts, but I can tell you, regardless of whether, this becomes a credentialed outlet or whatever happens, you are not going to see the bold-faced hypocrisy from myself that you saw from Nate Wilcox today. That kind of betrayal, setting up people for having them work under the premise that they're going to save this brand for years to come. I referenced how the product they built was Bloody Elbow 1.6, and the plan was to build out Bloody Elbow 2.0 for 2024. Well, Bloody Elbow 2.0 now belongs to GRV Media. And you see how it's already been gutted in favor of just becoming another clickbait farm. And and Nate Wilcox talked about how, I lost my shirt in this deal, and just trying to garner sympathy and save face by saying that like the tech team got paid for their efforts. It's fucking sad, but it's sad not just for the losing the space or losing the voice that was necessary in terms of being, if not necessarily counterculture, a necessary microscope and magnifying glass and investigative arm of journalism for highlighting the bad side, the many, many different bad factors that go into the production of high-level MMA. It's just really, really bold-faced hypocrisy from people that love to do moral grandstanding on fighters and other figures and promoters in this space. And they just end up behaving in the exact same way to save their own skin. So, Nate Wilcox, go fuck your own face. What you did today is absolutely pathetic. Your readers came to you when you cried out for help and helped you save your site, and you betrayed their trust today to save your own skin. That's fucking pathetic. You will never see that kind of behavior from MMA Rax. I promise you that. And you can hold me accountable for that for the rest of my life, or the life cycle of this brand, or whatever else. So I really, really needed to get that off my chest, because what happened today was really, really sad, but I hope that people understand just why it's sad and frustrating, not just merely because we're losing a voice, but because the people responsible for keeping that voice together decided to save their own skin instead of do right by their audience. It's really, really fucking pathetic. But hey, at least the Substack is still up. I'm sure that a lot of people are really going to gravitate to that the same way that they did when, the brand pivoted to doing a bunch of like clickbait on social media for the sake of, how else are we going to grow? It's ridiculous. Anyway, that's enough about that. I know that's not why most of you are here, but I felt as a budding creator, builder of a platform, I really needed to just drive that point home. So let's get into a recap of the last couple of events, because I know I said I've only been doing this for the pay-per-view aside from the victory lap I took after UFC 298. So let's look back real quick to the only favorite that I missed on UFC Mexico, which was the Rodriguez-Ortega fight. And I talked about how that fight kind of drove me nuts when it happened at UFC Long Island, because I picked Ortega, and then Ortega proceeded to get injured and lose. And I ran a ton of film for that, which included watching several 5-round fights for both fighters. And after having one of my worst days, to see that fight kind of end on injury was just one of those days where you just have to kind of put your head back and laugh like, everything that can go wrong will go wrong. To then have that manifest in losing a 40-unit night because I decided to lean on Yair as a parlay leg is unbelievably frustrating. But the only other option that I really had that was in the same range in terms of odds that night was Raoni Barcelos. And Barcelos, if you'll recall, dislocated his left shoulder in the first round against Christian Quinones, and was still able to battle back and find a submission in that one. But really required him to dig deep. And you can only imagine how, excited I got seeing Ortega roll his ankle in the beginning before the fight even started, get dropped in the first round by Yair, and, you're left thinking, okay, this hopefully he's going to be able to dispatch him pretty quick, and Yair inexplicably decides to go into Ortega's guard, try to finish him with a calf slicer, ends the round on bottom, and then Ortega at that point, when the adrenaline is kicked in, is able to just kind of shake off the ankle roll pain and whatever other damage he endured in the opening round and flip the fight totally back on his terms, to the point that he became the first person to submit Yair Rodriguez. Now, when I ran all that film many moons ago, one of the big things that stood out to me relative to why I felt comfortable picking Ortega in the first fight was Yair just did not at all have nearly as sharp fight IQ as Ortega did. And the reason that he lost the fight with Max Holloway was a largely similar reason to why he lost this second fight with Ortega. And that's that even in the Holloway fight, where Holloway has traditionally not shown any sort of interest in keeping his opponents on the ground, Rodriguez just was too willing to fight off of his back and gave away several late rounds in that fight because he was willing to spend too much time off of his back. And that's how you just let rounds slip away from you. And you saw that happen, the unwillingness to try to return to his feet in the second round of the rematch with Ortega. At that point, the momentum is flipped despite the strong first round from Yair, in which one of the judges even scored him a 10-8. And the response is Ortega comes out in round 3 when he has the momentum, and he's able to just put him on the ground again and submit him. So I feel kind of foolish for not, in spite of the fact that I knew based on what had been displayed on film, that if Ortega was going to put Yair on the ground, that he probably wasn't going to be able to get back to his feet. I was too willing to believe that Yair was smart enough to let Ortega up and keep the... I shouldn't say that he was going to let him up, but at least that he would recognize where he was best suited to find a finish and find victory, regardless of how long the fight lasted. And unfortunately, it just was not on display that night, in spite of all of the momentum being in Yair's favor in the immediate moments leading up to when the fight started, given Ortega injuring himself in the warm-ups, and then also Yair starting out the round on the feet with what was, in at least one judge's eyes, a 10-8 effort. So that was an extremely frustrating way to go out, particularly because the next fight, the Moreno-Royval plus 3.5, which was the same odds as Yair's money line, cashed very, very easily, as both fighters proceeded to fight a very sloppy, unorthodox, submission-free fight that Royval ended up winning just on sheer activity rather than accuracy. It was also kind of frustrating because I've hit something like almost 10 overs in a row at this point. I think the last one that I missed actually was... I mean, we're going back quite a bit now as I'm trying to find where this was. I think the last over that I missed was the Makhachev-Volkanovski plus 4.5 when they rematched at, what was that, UFC 294, 95? Not quite. I believe it was 295. No, I think it was 294. Yeah, 294. My last over since then that I've hit, Bonfim Dalby, which was a plus odds over. Brady Gastelum, which I think was like minus 200, but still, I'm not a big fan of plus 1.5s, but that one was a pretty easy cash, and one I probably should have leaned on harder as a parlay leg. I'm sorry. My last over that I actually missed was Tetsuro Taira versus Carlos Hernandez. But I also hit the Yadong Gutierrez plus 3.5 later that night, as well as the Roundtree Jr. Anthony Smith over, which was an underdog hit. So I've hit now 1, 2, 3. The next event I had Rachmanov Thompson and Edwards Covington as overs. So that was 4 in a row. Charles Jourdain versus Sean Woodson at UFC 297 was the next one, so that became 5. Jeremiah Wells, Max Griffin, about a month ago for Joe Pyfer, Jack Hermansson's Apex event, made it 6. And then in my clean sweep at UFC 298, I had Davalishvili Cejudo, which was minus 300, but still, I mean, fairly easy, a glorified wrestling match. Many people saw it. But then also the Whitaker Costa, which I leaned on for a parlay leg and at least one, and that ended up not necessarily easy because of that head kick that Costa had at the end of the first, was still, one I felt pretty good about getting. So, and then last week we had Moreno Royval, or not last week, but 2 weeks ago. And then last week, the only over that I had was Yavid Basharat versus Zahabi, which very, very proud. One of the prime reasons why I enjoy hedging on overs where the fight is expected to go the distance, because anybody that took Basharat at 400 not only got worse odds than fight goes the distance in a fight where, he's kind of predictably been dragging everything to decision, but you also got bit by Zahabi, a plus 500, 600 underdog at some books, scoring a unanimous decision win over the undefeated fighter. So I believe that's something like 9 overs in a row. Actually, I think it's about 10. So I've had very, very good momentum with that. At the start of 2023 last year, I had a record of 32, 33, and 1 on overs, which is way, way worse than what the average for cappers of yours truly ability is. And I really wanted to recover my record on that. And I've done that pretty considerably. I'm now 70, 49, and 1 lifetime for betting overs. So I believe that's 32 or 38 and 17 for all of my overs since the start of last year. So I've had significantly more, recouped significantly more success in betting those over the last year, as I've kind of tried to not hedge on rounds in fights as much where I'm going to put out a stay away. I talked about it, I think, in the middle of last year in terms of switching up my betting strategy, that in cases where I was recognizing a play was out of range relative to odds, just kind of staying off it instead of trying to put a pick out for it, and only really leaning on these hedges on rounds where I feel pretty good about the result based on, whether it's going to decision or a fight ending in the first half. It takes 2 to tango, and you need both parties to play responsibly for that. So, relative to last week's event, UFC Vegas 87, like I could see from a mile away that this event was just not going to be a super confident one. And I think that that's something that you need to recognize as you're betting on this, that it's like, oh, okay, we all want to put money on these to, make it somewhat more exciting. But last week I felt so good just watching the whole event as a fan for the first time in a very, very, very long time, like probably at least 2 years. And I could tell that for the 2 favorites that I had that were graded inside of minus 200, that there were very, very obvious paths to having both of those bets blow up in my face, to the point that I wasn't going to just make them parlay legs for the sake of what the numbers were telling me. I could tell Abdul Karim Al-Sawadi had been knocked out 3 times in a row prior to getting, not in a row, but 3 times in the first round prior to getting to the UFC, and that there was a very obvious chin concern against a powerful hitter in Loic Radzhabov. And even though Al-Sawadi had the momentum going into round 3 and had even the fight out to 19-19, and seemed to have the momentum. There was still going to be that initial flurry from Razabov to come out and try to find a finish, as he showed in this fight with Rybovics, that he had the potential to earn a knockout, not only in the first round, but in the early stages of any of the other rounds. And that's exactly what ended up happening in round 3. I think if that fight went to decision, he probably would have ended up losing it. I think some people might have been surprised, especially Razabov bettors, that Al-Sawadi was getting the better of Razabov on the ground, particularly in the second round. But again, it takes one punch to end a fight, and Sawadi was chinny enough that I knew leaning on that was not going to be the right way to go. The other one, Gaziev, I mean, everybody talked about all week, and even I said it when I put out the pick. If this fight goes beyond, I gave him 10 minutes, but really, I mean, it was pretty apparent that if the fight got out of the first round, that he was going to start getting tired. And Rozenstruik, unlike a lot of these heavyweight fighters that have a rep for just, especially the ones that lean on their striking, or in Rozenstruik's case, kickboxing experience and acumen, if that fight dragged out beyond 5 minutes, that Gaziev was going to have an issue. But the question was going to be, is Rozenstruik going to invite, the heavyweight exchange, just kind of rush in, which is what he did against Chris Daukaus, at least, and was kind of forced to do against Francis Ngannou in their infamous exchange. But Rozenstruik very, very wisely did, and I don't necessarily think that he had the same strategy against Overeem, but based on that fight he had with Overeem, you had a very easy case to point to of Rozenstruik reserving enough of his finishing ability into the later rounds, in that case the latest round of the fight, where he would have enough left to go finish someone that had exerted as much of themselves possible to try to end the fight in the opening, in that case, 20 minutes. Gaziev didn't unanimously win the first round, but did not do enough early to put Rozenstruik away, and Rozenstruik was able to just kind of easily build off from there until he got to the point that Gaziev wanted to quit. It was pretty frustrating watching Gaziev's performance relative to the Boudet fight, where I bet against him heavily in favor of Boudet. But it seems like Gaziev is, as I've spoken before about how the heavyweight division kind of has the legitimate fighters, and then, the sloppy weight contenders, the Josh Parisians and Chris Barnett's, and, at one time, Chase Sherman's of the division, those guys kind of floating around there. It seems like Gaziev is going to be well suited for just competing and putting away those guys, particularly as he did against the former king of the sloppy weights, Martin Buday. So it's I could tell based on the way that it could kind of go either way, and that it was already a volatile heavyweight fight, that it wasn't going to be good to lean on that as a leg. So I made the executive decision to say, you know what, I'm not just going to piss away units here for the sake of having plays out and maybe getting rewarded, particularly on a fight where I don't have any underdogs graded to win. So I stayed off. And the last thing that I just want to say about that before getting into UFC 299 is, you really, as a bettor, I mean, you can't just look at cards like that going forward where you have so many wide favorites and just try to convince yourself that scraping value through props or whatever else is the way to go. There's some bettors in this space that make their living on props, and that's their style. And I tried to dip my toe into doing prop betting a little bit in the early stages of last year. I remember putting out for the last pay-per-view in Miami, Steve Garcia by KO, and feeling great that hit at plus 350. But you can't, if you're not a long-term props person that you know you've got sustained success in that, if you try to overextend your units into that, you're just going to end up really, really hammering away your ROI. And there's a ton of cappers last week that had really, really bad events that were putting up, something like, I never bet more than 10 units on an event, and I'm very strict about that every single week. There were some people last week that were betting 20, 25 units that ended up losing, somewhere in the amount of 5 or 6 units on that card because they were just too willing to invest in outcomes for prop bets on fights that had lines blown out to 400 and 500. You can't just bet, Eric Anders to get a finish against Jamie Pickett just because the line is wide, and you figure, oh, well, because the line is as wide as it is, he's going to be able to easily get a finish. You really got to stick by what you know and understand and what your style is, and not just go value hunting for the sake of value hunting. I will always preach betting results over value every single time. And when you do that, you tend to find more success and a more consistent edge in the market than just trying to invent value for the sake of getting some sort of return on a card where the market has already kind of destroyed the most baseline value in the money lines. So my advice to all of you going forward is stick with what you know and do not try to force it relative to hunting for value, whether it's looking for props or trying to convince yourself that, a line is wide, so I'm just going to take a flyer on an underdog because I think that the line is too wide, and I'm just opening or inventing a reason to take a flyer on a guy that might reasonably be priced out of being that favorite, or that's not what I mean to say. What I mean to say is if the line has already gotten wide because the fight is predicted to be non-competitive, in most cases there's a reason for that. If you can't chart a clear path to victory, or at least a reason for why the fight might end up proving competitive if, it does go the distance. In the case of Zahabi Basharat last week, the thing with Zahabi was that the guy is like low-key one of, if not the best defensive striker in the UFC. 72% significant strikes defended is insane. Nobody else is like touching that. So, and it was most prevalent in his fight with Ricky Turcios a few years ago, in which Turcios was a 2-1 favorite. So, but, you compare that to something like Christian Leroy Duncan versus Claudio Ribeiro, or even Ludovic Klein versus AJ Cunningham, Eric Anders versus Jamie Pickett, Steve Ercik versus Matt Schnell. You don't just take flyers on guys just because you think the line is wide. You've got to be able to chart a path to victory, and when you do that, you will find a more consistent return on your underdog picks rather than just saying, there's value here because the market is ridiculous. And to that point, that's going to be a subject on the first fight that I'm going to talk about for UFC 299 right now, which is Assu Almabayev versus CJ Vergara. Almabayev enters 18-2 and is ballooned out to a -500 favorite after finishing Ode Osborne in his UFC debut back in August. CJ Vergara is now a +360 underdog. He has not fought since defeating Vinicius Salvador by decision at UFC 291 last year. Prior to that, he had a very, very contentious fight with Daniel Lacerda that I put Vergara as an underdog at that fight night, Vera versus Sandhagen. that was not a good event for me. That was one of the worst parlays that I put out last year. I believe it was a Vergara. Oh gosh, who was Daniel Pineda fighting at that event? I think it was Tucker Lutz. It was a Vergara, Tucker Lutz, Chito, and Jaquani parlay, and Jaquani was fighting Albert Duraev, and he lost a decision in that one in somewhat, I don't want to say pathetic fashion, but it was kind of alarming given that Duraev's now out of the UFC, that Njokuani wasn't able to find success in that one. But I was very grateful the Vergara fight didn't get stopped, because he was very, very evidently hurt. It just kind of on his bike for the entire first round and fell over from a series of head kicks about 2 or 3 times at least. And it did look like at one point the ref was going to step in before Vergara was able to recover. And because that fight got out of the first round, Lacerda did kind of blow his gas tank a little bit pursuing the finish. Vergara was able to take over in the second round with the help of a friendly. I believe that fight night was in Houston or Texas, so Vergara was a local guy that had the backing of the crowd, was able to kind of shift the momentum around on Lacerda, but definitely did not fight to his 2-to-1 price tag that night, in spite of the fact that I had as much confidence in him as the market did. Now that fight kind of reveals that Vergara, in spite of the fact that he's never been knocked out, he's only been submitted, still cannot make you feel good about where that guy's chin is at, even at 32 years old. And especially against a guy like Almabayev, who has demonstrated one-punch lights-out power within the last few years and is really rounding into his prime age at 30 years old as a fighter. I completely understand why he's a heavy favorite in this, but the market has just gotten too out of hand here to where you can feel good about betting on this guy in only a second UFC fight. There are reasons to like Vergara here, between having far more UFC experience. I think that this could end up being a very interesting fight if it does go the distance, at least late, because we've seen Almabayev in his 2 losses. He got finished late, like within the last 10 seconds of the fight against Tagir Ulanbekov in what was only his 5th career MMA appearance. And then in the fight after that, he lost a split decision. So he has at least shown some ability to not necessarily be the superior late round performer between these guys. I believe Vergara, well, that's not necessarily true. Vergara's got one more fight going the distance than Almabayev does in his career, so just, a tad more experience in that regard. But we did see in his 3rd most recent appearance that Almabayev did win only by split decision as well. So there's some case to be made that Vergara might be able to come on late, especially because just by the numbers, he's going to have the edge on volume. So he may be the more active striker if he's able to avoid the mat late. But I think that all of the finishing upside here has to be on Almabayev. Vergara has no wins by submission in his UFC career. He has been submitted before by Tatsuro Taira, and has another submission loss on his record prior to that as well. So Almabayev, given the fact that he was able to beat someone that may be regarded as a step up in competition from Vergara in O'Day Osborne, you have to like Almabayev's potential to find a submission, I think, in the first 2 rounds of this fight as well. It's just there's some things to like about Vergara here, between having a slight 3-inch reach advantage, the edge in striking activity, at least based on volume from what the numbers have told us in Vergara's career. 6 significant strikes per minute one per every 10 seconds that he's in there for a guy that has gone to multiple decisions at this point has to make you feel good about his established volume at the UFC level. And now it's going to be his 7th appearance between Dana White's Contender Series and the UFC. So there's reasons to like Vergara here, but I think that the fight is at least Almabayev deserves to be a wide favorite based on his impressive showing against Osborne in his debut. He's going to be the harder hitter of the two, so he might be the first guy to earn a knockout on Vergara here. But if Vergara is able to survive a first-round flurry where Almabayev maybe overexerts himself a little bit going for the finish, kind of reminds you of another recent fight that a Kazakhstani fighter had against, gosh, I'm trying to remember. It was Charles Johnson that fought. This is going to drive me nuts because we just saw it happen. Let me look this up. My goodness. Forgive me for the dead air, especially as I'm going on this long about a fight that I'm not even going to be encouraging people. Azat Maxim, that was another case where we saw Maxim kind of overexert himself going for the finish early on and just kind of faded away as the fight got to the point where it was looking like it was going to go the distance, and Johnson was able to turn it on late and with more activity was able to beat Maxim by unanimous decision. That was a case where the line, I think, was narrower going in. I think Maxim closed as like a 2-1 favorite, and obviously the line is wider here. But Maxim was a guy that profiled as having the finishing upside there for the earlier rounds. In the same case here where you're looking at Almabayev having that same upside against Vergara, I just don't think that Vergara is as solid of a chin as Johnson, and there's certainly potential here for him to get knocked out. Even if a submission is probably more likely just based on the absence of his own submission game in the UFC. He has attempted submissions, but he only averages 0.2 per 15 minutes. So he's maybe got 1 or 2 across all of the UFC fights that he's had, and doesn't have any career wins in MMA by that. So it's not really a tool for him, and is a largely unproven factor here for Vergara. So I think there's enough reason to like Vergara to stay away from this in terms of you leaning on Almabayev if you're the type of person that likes to throw minus 500 or 400 fighters into parlays. But I wouldn't outright bet Vergara here either, just because I think Almabayev has all of the finishing upside in this. And if you're betting Vergara, you might as well just take his decision prop. So give me Almabayev to win, but don't bet this fight. Just sit back, let Almabayev prove himself, and hopefully we've just got another very interesting contender at if not contender, at least a name at flyweight to kind of beef up the. Hopefully we see him in the rankings soon if he does get a finish here, or at least get a fight with a ranked opponent. Tatsuro Taira would be a very, very interesting fight for him. I think maybe even a rematch with Tagir Ulanbekov would be in order. So I would like to see either one of those. But give me Almabayev here to prove himself. Like I said, don't bet this. This is, I think, the second fight in the bout order after Joanne Wood, Marnia Moroz. So let yourself enjoy this one as a fan. The next fight is Michel Pereira and Michal Oleksiejczuk. Pereira enters 29-11 after scoring a first-round knockout in a fight that I faded him against based on his ring rust against and the bit of risk in moving up weight class in Andre Petroski. there's a bunch of people saying, oh, he's now huge for, middleweight and he looks great at this weight class. I think the jury's still kind of out on that, just based on the fact that he was lauded as being an enormous welterweight and is now, moving up a weight class in which I think that people are going to be a little bit more measured up to his size and, perhaps skill level. Conversely, Michal Oleksiejczuk, formerly a smaller light heavyweight, has cut down to middleweight for his recent appearances across the last couple of years after losing a unanimous decision to Dustin Jacoby, in which Jacoby was carrying a leg injury and still ended up outboxing Oleksiejczuk and even, I think, scoring some ground control time in that fight too. Since then, Oleksiejczuk is 3-1 with 3 first-round knockouts over Sam Alvey, Cody Brundage, and Chito and Jaquani. And Oleksiejczuk, man, I mean, he's obviously, I've got a little bit of history. I still cannot believe that going into the Njokuani fight, he tagged me in his corner tweet. He was showing a little bit more love back then than, what I've seen this week, but I'm still, big fan of the guy, and I hope to see him do well. But I'm not picking him here just because I think, or I'm a fan of him, or he's one of the few fighters that has directly shown MMA Rax love in the past. There's a lot of reason, I think, to like Oleksiejczuk here than I think people are perhaps giving him credit for. Some people are saying that there's, the recency bias baked into this line based on the fight Oleksiejczuk had last time, and I just don't really understand that. Some people are saying that he's first round KO or bust, and I just have to really question that based on the fact that even though the guy has been winning fights by his first round finishes predominantly in the UFC, the guy at least does have a decision win. He beat Khalil Roundtree by unanimous decision in his UFC debut, although obviously that got overturned due to a PED suspension. But that was over, that was like 6 years ago. At this point, it was at the end of 2017 when that happened. So he spent his time away, and I don't think has necessarily had a more impressive win in that time since then. I would say that his most impressive win since that one was probably over his most recent one over Chito and Jaquani. Obviously, Brundage has proven to be a pretty volatile fighter, and Alvey that was his last UFC appearance, I believe, and he was dying to make weight on the scale in that one. But the interesting thing about when you look at this, just relative to, I never put out my technical traits in terms of like the other factors that I consider further than what the numbers are representing when I talk about these fights. So it's probably, if you were looking at the stats window that I put out for this going into this week, you're probably wondering, well, Oleksiejczuk doesn't really have anything going for him other than being a southpaw and having twice as many UFC finishes as Pereira and a better rep in terms of winning the final round than what Pereira has. So given that Pereira profiles as the more well-rounded guy, why do you feel good about picking Oleksiejczuk here? So it's important to recognize a few things. Number one, these guys are pretty even in terms of the striking, but the fight that Pereira just had was the first fight that we've seen him knock a guy out with one punch. And it came against someone in Petrosky who hadn't been finished in the first round before, but prior to his first appearance in the UFC, had suffered a knockout at the hands of Aaron Jeffrey, who has since gone on to Bellator to somewhat limited success. Also lost on Dana White's Contender Series twice to Brendan Allen as well as Caio Borralho. So not necessarily the worst opponent to get finished by, but it was there were a lot of people that were openly questioning Petrosky's ability, and I had been willing to play him just based on the fact that Pereira hadn't been around for a while and was moving up a weight class. But I mean, you could tell he was very, very quickly outclassed, and Pereira ended up finishing that fight remarkably quickly. But I think that is kind of baked into why Pereira is a front runner here, in spite of the fact that both of these guys are coming off first round wins. The interesting thing is Pereira, prior to getting to the UFC, had not been someone that had a lot of success late into fights. He had lost plenty of decisions throughout his career. He actually lost his first 4 fights that went to decision. He lost 3 of them. Also lost a decision to Carlston Harris in 2015. And just had not really shown strong ability in fights that had gone out late beyond the first round, in the way that people are kind of attributing to Oleksiejczuk in the lead up to this fight. And then his first decision in the UFC, obviously one of the most infamous upsets in recent memory, in which Tristan Connolly was able to pull off the win in front of his friendly Vancouver crowd, because Pereira spent something like a Cowboy Oliveira intro doing a bunch of animated theatrics for 10 minutes and then kind of blew his gas tank by doing backflips and stuff, and too many spinning attacks, if you will, capoeira, in the beginning stages of his fight with Connolly. Then in a fight that he was kind of dominating in the Diego Sanchez fight, ended up throwing an illegal knee and getting himself disqualified. And since then, he's ripped off 4 straight wins. And I felt good enough against when he fought Ponzinibbio to make him a parlay leg for that night. And that was actually the week before I started MMA Rax, in which I nearly got a clean sweep, and I think the only fight that I missed that night was when Omar Morales was fighting Uros Medic. So that ended up costing me a clean sweep, but I got every other pick right that night, and I felt good enough about the momentum Pereira had and the like turnaround he had made at that point and I think it was more of a not speculative, but he had a significant advantage in the age gap there relative to Ponzinibbio that felt good about where that was going to go. But he did fade late in that fight, which is one of the reasons that it ended up being a split decision. And that's kind of been a rep still for a lot of these fights that he's had. He did get a unanimous decision against Chaos Williams, but I think that was another situation in which if that fight had been under the current rule set in which they were valuing damage predominantly, that Chaos Williams possibly could have ended up making that a split. He faded against Nico Price, and I think dropped the 3rd round unanimously in that one too, but had done enough work in the first 10 minutes to get a win there. The more surprising thing was that he wasn't able to finish Andre Fialho in what I believe was Fialho's UFC debut. And that fight, his performance in that, given that it was I don't know if it was short notice, but at least just his first showing in the UFC in that one, given it was against an opponent of Pereira's level, provided encouragement for how his career was going to go. Then he knocked out Cameron Van Camp a short time later at UFC 274, another event I was in attendance for. I was actually walking into the venue right as he knocked out Van Camp and saw it happen as soon as I got through the tunnel to make my way to my seat that day in Phoenix. And then Fialho proceeded to get knocked out in 4 straight fights after that, to the likes of Jake Matthews and then eventually Tim Means. So given the fighters that were able to get the finish over him and Pereira was not, and Pereira's tradition of like fading in the late rounds, you know that this is a guy that when you see that, at least by my pretty usually accurate assessment in terms of final round ability seems to only be winning the final round at a less than 50% clip. You see that reflected in even the decisions that this guy is winning unanimously. So if this fight does go the distance, I do think that there's sneaky upside for Oleksiejczuk, especially as the harder hitter. Where this gets dangerous for Oleksiejczuk is if Pereira decides to take this to the ground, because Oleksiejczuk's takedown defense is not great, and he is getting doubled up in terms of takedowns landed relative to what Pereira offers. And even though Pereira hasn't really been leaning on going to the ground in a lot of these fights lately, if he does decide to do that, he does profile as the better athlete between the two. I just don't know if he's going to have the offensive, the danger in top control to hurt Oleksiejczuk the way that we've seen Oleksiejczuk able to do from his own top control ability. So I think offensively on the ground, you still have to like what Oleksiejczuk offers a bit more. I see people speculating that, because Oleksiejczuk's submission record is only 1-4 and he's been submitted 3 times in the UFC. Granted, 2 of those were when he was a smaller light heavyweight up a weight class against the likes of Ovince St. Preux and Jimmy Crute. The other guy that submitted him was, 2 fights ago last year, Caio Borralho, but obviously that guy's a freak athlete for the middleweight class too. But Borralho has shown much better ability to retain dominant position and even submission credentials at the UFC level than what we've seen from Pereira. Pereira's only submission win in the UFC was against a 25-year-old welterweight that never fought again after that. And Salim Imadaev did not win a single fight in the UFC when he made it up in the COVID era of 2020. So I don't want to say the jury's still out, but Pereira only averages barely over half of a submission attempt per 15 minutes in his UFC career. So I don't think that even though you have to favor him in terms of the submission equity, the win upside there for this matchup, it's still not something that I think you're going to have to be realistically worried about in terms of ending this fight. What I'm more concerned about is Oleksiejczuk's ability to return to his feet if the fight does hit the floor. But he showed a bit of improvement in that area with regard to his last fight against Chito Njokuani, even though, again, Njokuani traditionally not a guy that is ever going to the ground in any sort of facet. So you have to imagine Pereira is going to be the more sophisticated fighter if it hits the floor in that regard than what Njokuani had available for Oleksiejczuk in that. But we have only seen barely over a minute of Pereira fighting up at this weight class with 15 more pounds of weight on his body. And for a guy that has not been traditionally the strongest performer at when fights go the distance, in spite of the fact that he's got over 3 times as much experience going the distance than what Oleksiejczuk has, you have to wonder how moving up in that weight class is going to affect his gas tank when he's already shown issues in that regard previously in his UFC career, especially if he tries to overexert himself in the first round going for a finish. And Oleksiejczuk is a guy that throws very hard and is committed to landing body shots. It's one of the big reasons why he was able to battle back and make Njokuani quit. And even if he doesn't find a one-punch lights out shot as he has in some of these other fights, you still really, really have to like Oleksiejczuk's ability to hurt his opponent here over a 3-round fight. And if he's able to at least survive a first round that may include a bit more of a attempt to grind on the fence and put the fight on the floor from Pereira's part than what Oleksiejczuk is comfortable with, if this fight goes into the later rounds, I expect Oleksiejczuk to be the more comfortable operator, particularly as he's dropped down, taken 20 pounds off from when he was a light heavyweight. Again, it's when fighters do that, when they move down in weight class, you worry about their chin, and Oleksiejczuk is a guy that has been finished in the first round before, but only one time, and it was 10 years ago in his career at that point. at which he would have been 19 years old, or 19 or 20 years old. Pereira's been finished in the first round much more recently, and it happened at the hands of Dusko Todorovic, and he did get caught in that one in the first round in the last 30 seconds of it. And that was only back in 2018, so much more recently than when Oleksiejczuk suffered his only first-round knockout loss. So if this fight does end by knockout, I think that you have to like Oleksiejczuk's ability to get it done much more than Pereira. And I think that if this fight goes the distance, there's more encouraging signals for what Oleksiejczuk has than what Pereira has demonstrated. So I really like Oleksiejczuk as an underdog here. I'm glad that the fight isn't line. It's not really narrowed. He's still kind of, when I put the pick out, he was plus 135, and I think he's kind of come in closer to like 125 as the week has gone on. But I still expect him to be the underdog in this one, just because there's a lot of narratives that Pereira is the more technical guy. And I think even though he's the more well-rounded fighter in terms of the skills that he has available, I don't necessarily think that that's true in terms of boxing acumen and certainly overall fight IQ. Oleksiejczuk has never lost by disqualification, and that's a rare thing for fighters at this level anyway. So I don't know how you can make the case here that Pereira is going to have the more polished acumen, even if he has been fighting somewhat smarter than what he demonstrated in his earlier UFC appearances against Connolly and Sanchez. There's reasons to like Pereira here for sure, and I won't be surprised if he wins, if he chooses to lean on his ground game, which Oleksiejczuk has shown greater struggles with than figuring out, fights on the feet. But if this does stay on the feet, the knockout upside, I think, has to be much more in Oleksiejczuk's favor based on the body of work than what we've seen from from Pereira. And I for that reason, he's one of my underdog picks this week, and I'm going to be taking Polish Power to get the upset. The next fight is Ion Cutelaba and Philipe Lins. Cutelaba enters 17-9-1 after a first-round knockout over Tanner Boser a little under a year ago at Fight Night Holloway versus Allen. We have not seen Lins since June of last year at the Kaikara France Albazi Fight Night, in which he Walden stalled Maxim Grishin to a unanimous decision win. A few months prior to that, he knocked out Ovince St. Preux in the first minute of their fight at Fight Night Andrade versus Blanchfield. These two were slated to go at UFC Vegas 80 in October, and Lins pulled out on fight day with an illness. That was an excruciatingly difficult thing for me because I made the under on that fight, or that weekend, a parlay leg, and proceeded to nearly get reverse swept, and was saved by the grace of Joe Pyfer submitting Abdul Razak Al-Hassan early in the second round of their fight, which was a performance that prompted me to think that Pyfer was going to have enough of an advantage in terms of strength and bringing the fight to the ground if he so chose to handle Jack Hermanson, and that didn't end up coming to fruition. But Pyfer ended up saving me from a reverse sweep that night. I was pretty devastated losing that Cutelaba Lins under, and so I've been eyeing that like a hawk all week. And it was interesting. If you saw my tweet Sunday morning, I pointed out that in spite of the fact that this got rebooked on February 9th, according to reports from the likes of Marcel Dorf, there was no book that had a line available on this fight until Monday morning, which was highly unusual. I believe Cutelaba opened as something like a 160 favorite. That got immediately bet down to a pick'em, and Cutelaba has since floated back out to minus 130 range, which I think is appropriate. I do have a very strong grade on Cutelaba, which is why I've decided to put him out as just the money line pick at this stage. But I'm still waiting for the under to come out on this again, and I'm hoping that it's going to be a similar number to what it was at UFC Vegas 80, which was basically what Cutelaba's money line is right now, because I think there's a lot more value on Cutelaba potentially getting dropped early because he's been finished or at least knocked out in the first half of, I believe, the last 5 fights that he's lost. 5 fights in a row for Cutelaba. He's been finished in the first half. In 4 of those cases prior to the Nchekwu knockout, he was in a fight where I actually took the over. He has been finished in the first round of 4 straight fights prior to that one. Or not straight fights, but the losses that he had have all been in the first half of those. So I absolutely think, especially based on how Linz knocked out St. Preux last year, that there's finishing upside for Linz early here. The thing that makes me a little bit concerned about taking an under is that Linz has shown a tendency to try to stall out fights in which he is kind of worried about not having striking advantages. Lost a unanimous decision to Andrei Arlovsky in his UFC debut, and that was his first appearance coming off of winning a PFL championship in 2018. I believe he got popped for performance-enhancing drugs, which is why he didn't appear at all in 2019 and then didn't show up again until around COVID time of May 2020, and had a pretty underwhelming heavyweight run that included getting knocked out by Tanner Boser as COVID kind of pressed on. You don't really see fighters reinvent themselves at the age that Linz is now at 38, but is now on a 3-fight win streak after implementing a bit of a wall install against Marcin Prachnio, but surprisingly getting the fight to the ground there. I took Prachnio to win that night, and I made him a parlay leg. Again, this was before MMA Rax went live, but I did it on the basis that in the first 2 fights we hadn't really seen Linz try to initiate any sort of ground game, and he ended up finally getting his first UFC takedown in that fight and showing a bit more well-roundedness that he had in his previous UFC appearances in that regard. Next fight, I took Ovince St. Preux as the underdog, and that ended up proving not to be a good decision at all. But he was the underdog against Maxim Grishin, and I felt good about playing him in that fight, given the wall install tendency he showed against Prachnio. I thought was going to be good for mitigating Grishin's most effective area of keeping it on the feet, and that's exactly what ended up happening. So even though I feel more comfortable playing the under here than I would Cutelaba money line, I certainly think that there's a bit of a risk here that Linz fights smart to the point of trying to mitigate the early power from Cutelaba and then kind of just stalling that out to a decision, whichever way it goes. The interesting thing about that would be, though, that Linz really isn't that great of a wrestler, in spite of the fact that that's kind of what he's tried to lean on in at least 2 of his 3 most recent appearances. And perhaps part of that is as being a former heavyweight, he still wants to retain some of the strength that he had in terms of fighting bigger opponents at that stage and moving down to a weight class where some guys are going to be a little bit smaller. Some people have said that Linz is going to have a huge size advantage here, and I really don't think that's the case. He's only an inch taller, and he is going to have a 3-inch reach advantage, but the more proven, harder hitter longer term here has clearly been Cutelaba. And even though Tanner Boser is extremely chinny, we've still seen Cutelaba be able to put people's lights out in the past, including Khalil Roundtree Jr. Less than 5 years ago. Also fought Dustin Jacoby to a draw, rather. But the concerning thing here, I think, for Cutelaba is that even though he's beaten lower level guys, he just hasn't really been able to step up against a lot of the better, at least ranked competitors in the UFC. And Linz is a little bit of a wild card in terms of where he's at in this stage of his career, particularly for a guy that got popped at one point for performance-enhancing drugs. And given the recent changes around USADA and the UFC, you wonder how much he's taken advantage of the lightening of scrutiny in that regard, as some people have come to expect. It's going to be interesting to see him on the scale on Friday, what he looks like relative to where he was at in recent years. But it does worry you a little bit that Cutelaba was able to break out of a 3-fight losing streak with the win over Tanner Boser. But if you look at the recent wins that he has had in his UFC career, it's been Jonathan Wilson, which was a decision win down at middleweight against a guy that I don't believe won any of his fights in the UFC. He did win his debut in 2015, but did not win any other fights after that, and only fought 3 times afterwards in MMA over what proved to be like a 5-year period. So not a high-level win in that regard. Enrique da Silva and Gadzimurat and Tigalov. Tigalov lost all 4 of his fights after getting knocked out by Cutelaba, and had been someone that had been finished several times prior to even going into that fight. And Enrique da Silva fought one more time against Gokhan Saki and lost in what looks like Saki's only MMA win period. Shortly after the Cutelaba loss, came back and tried to fight on Dana White's Contender Series for Brazil against Johnny Walker about a year later and lost a unanimous decision. And then, the win against Khalil Roundtree obviously still grades out as his most impressive performance. Was able to beat Devin Clark at his own game 3 years ago in terms of wrestling to a decision there, but still kind of surprised he wasn't able to, get a better finish in that regard. But the fact that he was able to beat a wrestling first opponent like Devin Clark should make you optimistic for how, if he needs to get into a situation where the fight goes to the fence or on the ground, he's at least going to be able to probably demonstrate a bit better of a skill set there than what Linz has demonstrated. That's definitely represented in not only the takedown rate that Cutelaba has, but also the efficiency with which he gets the takedowns. Cutelaba gets more than 1 for every 2 attempts that he has, whereas Linz is barely landing 1 for every 3 attempts that he has. So even though Linz technically has 100% takedown defense, hasn't necessarily been challenged yet by any of these guys. He's really only fought, if not in the case of Ova and St. Preux, then certainly the case of Maxim Grishin and Marcin Prachnio, fighters that would prefer to make things more of a kickboxing match. And in the case of, St. Preux, he was like 39, 40 years old in that fight. And Tanner Boser, another guy that would prefer to strike, and Andrei Arlovsky, another rather old opponent that wasn't really going to be able to effectively test Lin's takedown defense, I think. So there's a lot of reasons to like Cutelaba here, but again, the inconsistency of performances, particularly when the step-ups in competition have arrived, I think give a lot of people an understandable amount of pause. I still think this is a really good setup for him here, just because in addition to the age gap, which has to come back to bite Linz eventually, given that he's 38 years old, I talked about Linz moving down in weight and how when you do that, you're taking weight off of your chin, and that is most dramatically demonstrated for fighters that move down from heavyweight to light heavyweight or light heavyweight to middleweight, which I know I talked about in the case of Oleksiejczuk, but with that regard, Oleksiejczuk had only been knocked out 1 time in 2014. Linz is a guy that got TKO'd by injury when he was in Bellator, and in 2 of his 3 fights after that got knocked out by punches, and then got knocked out in one of his previous UFC appearances in the first round against Tanner Boser, another guy that wasn't really a true heavyweight that has since had to move it down to light heavyweight in his own regard. I think giving him a rematch with Tanner Boser would be kind of interesting, particularly if Lins loses this fight. But the move, taking weight off the chin for a guy that's already been knocked out 4 times, has to give you pause in terms of just what is going to happen here. Now, I am a little bit worried that Lins may, pull some sort of... He's got several wins by submission in his career in Bellator, and he did win by guillotine in PFL about 5-6 years ago at that point. He hasn't attempted a submission yet in the UFC, so given Cutelaba does not have a favorable submission record himself, there's certainly potential for Cutelaba here, in spite of the fact that he has multiple submission wins by omoplata in his MMA career. There's potential for Lins to maybe pull a guillotine out of his hat if Cutelaba does decide to try to score a double leg or something and take this to the ground. But Lins, the combination of age and taking weight off of his chin at this stage of his career, has to come back to bite him eventually. And Cutelaba is easily going to be the hardest hitter that he's faced in his UFC career, in spite of the fact that his first 2 appearances were at heavyweight. So I think that there's certainly good finishing upside here for Cutelaba, where, I agree with the fact that he's reflected as a strong pick. And you worry just a little bit about the consistency, given he got reversed by Johnny Walker in spite of having top control, to where he ended up losing that fight. And that was a fight where I picked Johnny Walker to win as a pretty healthy, I think, plus 185 underdog. But Cutelaba was also a 300 favorite against Ryan Spann and ended up getting guillotined there within the first half of the first round of that fight. And even though had good moments against Nchekwu, just was not able to keep up with the sheer size of Nchekwu, who's kind of a freak for the weight class in that regard. So Lins is obviously not presenting as many puzzles as, the high level of opponents that Cutelaba has fought previously. But, even with that inconsistency, I would still say that drawing Dustin Jacoby is a more impressive result than any of the ones that we've seen from Lins in his UFC career. So I'm picking Cutelaba to win. If we get a similar number on the money line that we do for the under, as we had at UFC Vegas 80, I'm going to have to take the under there, just because I think that both of these guys have really, really good finishing upside in the first round, given what I just talked about. Not only detrimental to Lins, but also the fact that Cutelaba, his own inconsistencies and some of the mistakes he's made against higher level opponents, there's potential for Lins to take advantage of that if he does not opt to just go for a wall and stall. But that's something that could jeopardize, I think, the potential for the under to hit. At the same time, given he's got just one more fight of experience going the distance and a bit better history of winning in the final rounds, I think that there is potential for Lins, as this fight goes on, to be a little bit more effective. But given that he's going to have to rely on walling and stalling against a guy that's got a far better takedown rate and has proven to be a more effective wrestler, I think that it would serve Lins well to try to get a fast start here. So I'm going to be taking Cutelaba. I understand why for people it's difficult to trust him, but I think that this is a good spot for him, given the stage that Lins is at in his career. And, that Cutelaba, in spite of the fact that maybe he doesn't have a lot of high level wins further than Khalil Roundtree, before Roundtree's metamorphosis has kind of really gotten to take shape, there's still enough reason to like Cutelaba based on the more well-roundedness he's demonstrated here than what we've seen from Lins at 38 years old. So give me eye on Cutelaba to win. The next fight is Kyler Phillips and Pedro Munhoz. Phillips enters 11-2 after returning from a bit of a layoff in August of last year. Prior to that, he had not been seen since UFC 271. in which he got a late submission over Marcel Rojo. He did beat Raoni Barcelos by unanimous decision in August last year at Fight Night Sandhagen vs. Font. Munhoz is coming off of a unanimous decision loss at UFC 292 to Marlon Vera, in which I made Chito a parlay leg and was a bit nervous in the first stage of that fight, given it was a 3-round fight that Chito characteristically started slow before really outclassing over the last 10 minutes. As Munhoz, despite the fact that he technically outstruck Chito, it really just did that because the guy has been doing what he's been doing for Lord knows how long at this point in his UFC career, of just absolutely cheesing on low leg kicks, which was one of the main reasons why I told people to stay away from betting his fight with Sean O'Malley, that, you know, ended in a no contest. But I believe in at least the eyes of 2 judges, Munhoz ended up stealing that first round just because he was really, really attacking the legs of Sugar Show. And that fight ended up, I don't know whether he ended up embellishing the eye poke a bit to where the fight, you know, kind of ended because maybe he felt it was starting to get away from him in the second round. But, you know, I think it's pretty easy to at least read where this guy is at this stage of his career. But then he really, really, I think, surprised a lot of people against Chris Gutierrez by turning that around as a big underdog and getting a unanimous decision win in that fight, in which he dropped Gutierrez in the first round. And he has demonstrated that he's a fighter that can put your lights out. He is going to, I think, have the power advantage in this fight. I didn't necessarily think, which I thought he kind of had against Chito Vera too, but Chito's a fighter that's never been finished, and I didn't expect him to drop him the same way that, you know, he did Gutierrez, and Gutierrez is a fighter that's never been knocked out himself. But Chito's also a guy that I think has demonstrated a bit more of a versatile skill set than what Gutierrez had, which is one of the reasons why Chito was able to turn that fight around down the stretch and win a unanimous decision. There's people that will make the case that Munhoz won that fight, but I bet that that's just everybody that bet on Munhoz to beat Chito and was fading him based on the fact that they were pissed off that Chito got what probably didn't deserve to be a split decision against Corey Sandhagen. So what I think is going to happen here, I've got a very, very strong grade on Kyler Phillips. It's not just because of the age gap, but as I said, Munhoz has just proven to really be predominantly a cheeser on leg kicks at this stage. Phillips is going to enjoy a 7-inch reach advantage that I think he's really going to allow him to lean on the jab if he so chooses. Has shown greater versatility and efficiency in his MMA skill set, particularly with getting takedowns when he wants them. But so, you know, some people are probably thinking based off that, well, if you're so confident in Phillips in terms of the well-roundedness he offers and the reach advantage and the age gap, why wouldn't you just play his money line here, and why are you opting to hedge on rounds? And that's because we have consistently seen in Kyler Phillips's UFC run, and even a little bit prior to that, that he tends to fade late in fights, even if it's not necessarily because he's tired. Maybe it's because he's just banked. He believes that he's banked the first 2 rounds and doesn't really want to put himself in danger of getting finished late, despite the fact that he's never been knocked out or submitted. But the consistent pattern that we've seen, even in his most recent appearances, that the guy will let the later round get away from him in a way that I think has to make you at least a little bit concerned. He lost a split decision to Victor Henry prior to getting into the UFC. It was in the immediate aftermath of his Dana White's Contender Series appearance in the first season. Against Song Yadong, which was the best win of his career that he's had to this point, he unanimously gave up the 3rd round after banking the first 2, lost a majority decision to Raulian Paiva, and then against Raoni Barcelos in a fight that he was, you know, comfortably dominating through the first 10 minutes, he let Barcelos get back into it and make that fight closer than it needed to be in the closing stages, despite the fact that he was a 2-1 favorite. And two of the judges ended up giving Barcelos the third round in that respect. So Barcelos did win the fight, or not the fight, he did win the third round of the fight in the closing stages in a way that I was wondering if, maybe the time away or the ring rust would hurt Kyler Phillips' chances up front, but he was able to get a knockdown in the first round, I believe, of that fight and really comfortably put himself ahead. But you still don't like seeing a fighter that, if not necessarily taking the third round off, puts themselves in a bit of a more vulnerable position by taking their foot off the gas late in such a consistent manner. So it kind of you look at the final round grade that I gave him in the graphic that I put out, and it sits at 83%, which is a full 30% higher than what Munhoz has. But Munhoz has nearly 3 times as much experience going the distance as Kyler Phillips does. And in a fight where neither of these guys have ever been knocked out or submitted, where you feel so good about, because of that, the ability for the fight to go to distance, and the fact that the guy that's going to presumably have the power advantage in this fight leans so much more heavily on low leg kicks than actually, getting inside and knocking guys down at this stage of his career, you just have to wonder what is this fight going to look like if Phillips ends up getting knocked down by Munhoz as the more powerful hitter in either the first or the second round, particularly if it happens in the second round, given the consistent trend of Phillips taking his foot off the gas in the third round. That has to worry you against a guy in Munhoz that has shown better ability, or at least has not better ability, but has more experience going the distance to thrive in the later moments. So I'm just too worried about Phillips potentially dropping one of the first 2 rounds, especially if Munhoz comes out and starts fast, which is something that he's shown to do pretty good urgency with, not just in the Chito Vera fight, but also in the fight against Chris Gutierrez and the fight against Sean O'Malley. If Munhoz ends up stealing that first round and Phillips kind of takes his foot off the gas going into the third round, you have to, I think, be a little bit worried about what the judges are going to see here. So I think that the over is the much safer play, given that neither one of these guys has ever been finished. You wonder if Munhoz's chin is going to betray him eventually, given all the attrition, but the guy is just... he's solid, man. Some of these, it's particularly something you see more with the Brazilian fighters that have never been knocked out. Francisco Trinaldo comes to mind as a guy that even at 44 years old just never seemed to get put out of there and really retained his knockout power even into his late 40s. Munhoz kind of profiles as the same guy. And I think that you really, really have to take that into account here, even if you feel really confident in Kyler Phillips. As I am, given, again, the age gap and the 7-inch edge and reach and the somewhat the better ability to win on volume that goes further than just kicking low legs. And Munhoz certainly profiles as the worst defensive striker here, and hasn't really won any fights in the UFC by submission other than guillotine, I believe. The only fight that he's won in the last decade by submission that didn't come from guillotine was from a heel hook that he got in 2012. So unless, Phillips ends up shooting a sloppy double leg or something that gives Munhoz an opportunity, who only averages half a submission attempt per 15 minutes anyway, I don't think that the finishing upside for either one of these guys is good. And because Kyler Phillips has shown that ability to kind of that consistent trait of stalling out late, it just has to make you a little bit cautious if Munhoz starts fast, is able to get the first round in at least 2 of the judges' eyes, and then that just kind of puts the fight in a position where you expect Phillips to make reads and battle back and win the second round. But given the consistent trait of fading late, you just wonder how that's going to leave the third round. And I would much rather have my money in the hands of the clock than the judges at that point. So I'm taking the +2.5. I do think Phillips should win, but I'm going to be very curious to see how he fights this third round, given the pattern of taking his foot off the gas that we've seen throughout his MMA career. The next fight is Mateusz Gamrot and Rafael dos Anjos. Gamrot enters 23-2 after picking up a injury win over Rafael Fiziev at UFC Fight Night. Fiziev Gamrot in what was a bit of an underwhelming performance, just given or not underwhelming performance, but an underwhelming result given the hype that went into that fight as one of the higher level striker versus grappler matchups of the year. I did have Gamrot as an underdog to win in that fight, so it was kind of unfortunate that the result played out the way that it did. I also very firmly believe that, not just because I had Sarukian money line the night that it happened, but I don't believe that Gamrot beat Sarukian that night, and the loss to Dariush hasn't necessarily aged gracefully either in a fight that he did get dropped in. But he's got a pretty good bounce back spot here against Rafael dos Anjos, who we last saw in his own Fight Night main event about a month prior, against Vicente Luque, in which Luque, despite having a long layoff after getting pretty brutally knocked out by Jeff Neal, was largely able to beat dos Anjos at his own game. Although it was interesting in the later rounds, dos Anjos showed, I think, a bit more life in the striking than maybe some people expected, and kind of, at least in the later stages of the fight, was able to outstrike Luque. So maybe showed a bit more left than what some people were expecting he had in that regard. But Gamrot is an enormous favorite here. And I have this fight graded pretty narrowly. I actually had it as a dead even grade before I took another look and realized that this is dos Anjos moving back down to lightweight after a handful of appearances at welterweight. And you have to wonder how hard that cut is going to be for him at 39 years old. And so there is a bit of, I think, of a weight cut risk here for dos Anjos that maybe wasn't necessarily there before. And for that reason, I think that you can probably lean Gamrot as the favorite here, but for the fight to be as wide as it is, I think is a little bit extreme. Even though it's harder and harder for fighters that have traditionally had to lean on, ground game and going the distance to have the most success possible in the UFC. It's a complicated spot for dos Anjos, given it's a 3-round fight and he's had so many different 5-round appearances throughout the last, at least 8 years of his career. Only I think a handful of his fights have actually been scheduled to go for 3 rounds. Memory serves, I believe, just Barberena, the Chiesa fight, and possibly his fight with, and I believe his fight with Neil Magny at UFC 215. And that's just fights that, going back to 2017. Even actually you go further back than that, the 3 fights he had prior to the Tony Ferguson fight that was scheduled for 5 rounds, those were all title fights, so those were all slated to be 5-round fights as well. So it's, I can understand why people so heavily believe that Gamrot is the guy to like here, between the risks that we've kind of seen for dos Anjos, but this is a guy that's got way more high-level experience just for MMA overall, and I think that Gamrot having people look at that just KO result with Fiziev, and I think they're kind of losing sight of the fact that that fight could have proven to be much more different if Fiziev, I think, and didn't end up tearing his ACL. I believe that it was some sort of knee injury that he picked up there. I picked Jailton Turner to beat Gaziev and was pretty disappointed to see that play out in a split decision in favor of Gamrot in a fight where I thought it was pretty obvious that Turner was doing more damage and Gamrot was just kind of leaning on, tying up Turner's legs and not letting that fight get to a place for the striking whenever possible. So even though that Gamrot is clearly a really, really effective guy on the ground, and you would think that that's probably going to be to the detriment of Dos Anjos at the age that he's at, that is still Dos Anjos' preferred world. And I think that Gamrot has not shown enough sophistication on the feet that given if Dos Anjos is able to keep this fight standing for even, a little bit of an extended stretch, I think that he's probably going to surprise some people in terms of what he still has left relative to what kind of effectiveness we've seen from Gamrot. And Dos Anjos is a guy that only one time in his career has he ever been finished prior to round 3, and that was against Eddie Alvarez about 8 years ago, so in a title fight. So I really like this fight to go the distance here. I was kind of disappointed that it's the plus 2.5 has now been steamed out to 300 after I put it out as like minus 265, just because Gamrot has shown a little bit of finishing ability, at least earlier in his UFC career relative to the one he's seen later. But given his most recent finish was the Fiziev fight in which he needed to rely on an injury for that, hopefully we just don't see that same kind of bad luck play out against Dos Anjos. So this one kind of profiles similarly to the glorified wrestling match that I described Dvalishvili and Cejudo as a short while ago. Although obviously I think the grappling ability, not just pure wrestling, but grappling ability for both of these guys is much higher than what you were going to see for both Henry Cejudo as well as Merab Dvalishvili. So the potential for a submission in that regard is a little bit higher, I think, but we've also only seen Clay Guida ever submit Dos Anjos, and that was, all the way back in 2010. And one thing that you see fighters actually improve in as they get into the twilight of their career is actually submission of defense is the one thing that continues to improve as fighters get older, because a lot of times it just comes down to not making mistakes and knowing what you have to do in order to protect your neck or whatever other parts of your body in jiu-jitsu exchanges or rolls or however you want to describe it as. So I would expect Dos Anjos to survive. I think Gamrot is going to win, but I do think this line is just way too wide to the point that it's not worth investing in him at this point. Because if it does, get weird to where it stays on the feet, Gamrot is just not able to be as effective with his shots. This could be a sneaky decision win for Dos Anjos. I think that there is a little bit of upside for him to win in that regard. So I'm going to be taking the plus 2.5. I expect Gamrot to win, but at the price tag that he was at, I think it was minus 400, and now at some places it's ballooning out to even 500. I mean, that's unplayable. And I just don't know how much finishing upside Gamrot has, even against Dos Anjos at this stage in his career, in spite of the fact that we did see Dos Anjos get knocked out against Fiziev, only not even a couple of years ago. But again, that was at the beginning of the 5th round. And again, this is a guy that is well-conditioned in spite of the fact that he's going to be having to take off weight and maybe a little bit weight from his chin then at this point to get back down to 155. This is a guy that's built for going so much longer than that and has only been finished one time prior to seeing round 3, that you really have to feel good about this fight, at least seeing round 3. And then for those first 2.5 minutes of round 3, I think I might be most worried about Gamrot finding a finish in that stage rather than traditionally where you see most finishes, which is the first round. So give me Gamrot to win, but I would much rather bet the plus 2.5 rounds here. Hopefully it comes down a little bit as the week goes on, because it got steamed pretty bad after Sunday, as did the over 2.5 on the Phillips and Munhoz fight. The next fight is Curtis Blaydes and Jailton Almeida. Blaydes has not been seen since nearly a year ago, in which he got knocked out in the main event of his fight night with Sergey Pavlovich, a result that since catapulted Pavlovich to a interim title shot against Tom Aspinall. Almeida was slated to fight Blaydes at the fight night Sao Paulo at the start of November of last year. Blaydes, I believe, had to pull out due to injury, and they were able to replace Blaydes with Derek Lewis. And I nearly had a clean sweep that night, but the one pick that I missed was taking the under on the Blaydes-Lewis fight, a fight that I figured was going to play out very similarly to Almeida-Rosenstrike, and another fight where I took the under. But Lewis showed pretty good. As I said, as fighters get older, even into the late 30s, the one area that they tend to show improvement in is their submission defense, and that was reflected in what happened with Derek Lewis and Jailton Almeida. But in spite of the fact that Almeida was, a visibly smaller heavyweight than Derek Lewis, he was still able to hold him down for most of the fight and get mat returns on his way to a very, very boring, in some respects, 5-round unanimous decision win. But, in terms of his ability to go the distance and show that he had cardio out beyond the first 2 rounds, there was a lot that we got to see from that fight that should give you encouragement for Almeida in terms of, if not his overall well-roundedness for MMA, at least his ability in implementing his game plan over an extended stretch against the bigger names in this weight class. And I think that's something that is getting pretty heavily discounted here in terms of this rebooking with Blaydes, because people have spoken about how Almeida, in what was originally going to be a fight for him in, native Brazil, he was originally a 2-1 favorite, and now this fight has since kind of become a pick'em in a way that I don't really understand. I do obviously think that if this fight stays standing, that Blaydes is going to have an advantage, and he's shown more sophisticated stand-up ability even in recent fights than what Almeida has shown. I think that you can look pretty easily to what happened with Chris Daukaus as an example of that, in a fight where Blaydes didn't really opt to put that on the ground perhaps as easily as he could have, and instead beat a guy in Daukaus who was going to have, some ability to at least push back and stand up in spite of having a much worse chin. Blaydes really opted to show that he could stand and strike in that one and beat Daukaus in his own game. I'm glad he didn't get a title shot off of the injury win over Tom Aspinall, because obviously that was more kind of an unfortunate circumstance than anything else. And then the Pavlovich win, people criticized his fight IQ in that performance, but I do think, he did try to shoot a takedown at least initially, but perhaps a bit too late relative to when it would have been better suited for him to do so. And after he had already been hurt, and because he had already been hurt, he just wasn't able to implement his game plan as effectively. I don't think that you're going to see that same him getting hurt as early and therefore unable to wrestle or put the fight where he enjoys it against Almeida. But the thing that I keep coming back to with Almeida is when he knew he was going to have a disadvantage on the feet against Rosenstrike, he dropped down all the way to the mat, got as low as he possibly could have, and just turned himself into a boa constrictor, getting on an ankle for a single leg against Rosenstrike, and then firmly getting that fight down to where he needed to when he realized he was in danger. That was such a... For a guy that bet the under and knew that it was pretty much going to have to be Almeida by submission in that respect if he didn't get knocked out by Rosenstrike, that was exactly what you wanted to see in terms of fighter that knows his strengths and his advantages and went out there to implement his game plan. I don't know how you can look at that and then see how he fought 5 rounds for Derek Lewis on his terms and come away thinking that Almeida is not going to try to do the same thing here against Curtis Blaydes. And Blaydes has shown, at least by numbers, very poor takedown defense relative to what the average is in the UFC. And I think the big thing that you have to remember relative to what has built up Blaydes' stock in this heavyweight division is the guy has had more well-rounded skills than what you see from anybody else in the weight class. It's just that he didn't have as high level of striking as the fighters that he lost to, or even some fighters that he faced like Rosenstrike, but he's been able to lean on the fact that there's not really a lot of well-roundedness at heavyweight to build up his own profile. That is not the case with Jailton Almeida. And in a lot of ways, Almeida is actually better at what Blaydes is good at for well-roundedness than where Blaydes has had his most effectiveness relative to wrestling and groundwork. It's kind of amazing, given how good of a wrestler that Curtis is, that he has no wins by submission in his MMA career. And granted, he has spent over 2/3 of his career in the UFC, but it just speaks to how not well-rounded the rest of the division is at this level, more than I think it does, Blaydes' own ability in terms of being a title contender. Almeida is far and away, the most dangerous guy for submissions in this weight class, which I think is part of the reason why he opted to move up to heavyweight when he presumably would have had an easier path to title contention at light heavyweight when he came into the UFC. I think that Almeida saw that, even though I'm going to be way bigger than everybody at light heavyweight, I can easily move up to heavyweight without really having to cut much weight and still be enough of a freak athlete to contend with the best of the best at this weight class. And I have enough well-rounded skills to the point where if I'm able to get the fight into my own world, I'm going to be able to dominate folks. And that's exactly what has happened across all 6 of his wins in the UFC. I don't understand why people think this one's going to be any different based on the complete lack of a submission game from Curtis Blaydes and the not good takedown defense he's shown that hasn't really been tested by anybody since his 4th UFC fight with Daniel Omielanczuk, which ended up going to decision. So the only other guy that's been able to take him down in that stretch is Volkov, and I think it happened at the end of like the 3rd or 4th round of a fight that Blaydes was still able to dominate, to like a 50-45 decision, just because Volkov wasn't going to be able to stop takedowns from a guy that had the wrestling level that Blaydes did, in a way that Tom Aspinall was able to take advantage of in his own fight with Volkov. This is the first guy that is really going to be able to give resistance to Blaydes and give it back to Blaydes in a way that he hasn't really had to deal with. You know who the biggest submission threat that Blaydes has faced in his UFC career to this prior is? Aspinall notwithstanding, because again, that fight was a freak injury occurrence. It was Oleksiejczuk Olenek when he was like 38 years old. I think that Almeida is in a really, really good spot here to deliver Blaydes' first loss by submission in his MMA career. I'm going to be curious to see what Blaydes' submission defense is like, given we just haven't seen much of it. But I would think that if Blaydes is committed, and he is based on what he's communicated in interviews this week, to keep this fight standing, and he just hasn't really had to have much experience with defending takedowns, and when he has, it hasn't been very good. We saw Almeida get takedowns and mat returns against a guy that is wearing more weight than him in Derek Lewis, and Almeida has shown he can dominate guys heavier than him in this weight class and keep the fight on his own terms. It's unfortunate that this isn't going to be a 5-round fight, because I think that in that case you probably feel good about Blaydes having a little bit more time to potentially keep the fight standing, particularly into the later rounds. But I don't know how you look at this and come away thinking that, even though the fight starts on the feet and Blaydes is presumably going to have the advantage there, how good can you feel about Blaydes leaning on his stand-up to beat a guy that is going to have much more well-rounded ability on the ground? Even if Blaydes ends up getting good position on the ground against Almeida, I still like Almeida's ability to sweep and return to his feet and turn things around on the fence and get his own takedowns and hold the position over Blaydes to where he'll be able to advance, and Blaydes will have to defensively wrestle in a way that he hasn't really had to demonstrate at heavyweight. I am surprised that Almeida is the slight underdog here. And even though I do have this graded as a close fight, even though most of the knockout equity I think belongs to Blaydes just because of the stand-up, I don't know how you come away looking at this thinking that Almeida, especially based on what he did in the Rosenstrike fight, I very easily could see him doing the same thing in terms of dropping all the way down to the floor to where he can't be hit and just getting one foot and turning that into a single leg that he's then able to use to put the fight in his world. So I think this fight goes to the ground much more quickly than people are expecting and then Blaydes wants. And the longer that it's on the ground, the more that I think Almeida is able to demonstrate his effectiveness and test Blaydes in a way that he just really hasn't been able to encounter much resistance previously, given the division he's in. So give me Almeida to win. I'll say that he does it by submission, but I wouldn't be surprised if he gets something like a 29-28 in which he wins the first 2 rounds getting to the mat, and then perhaps later, Blaydes is able to maybe keep the fight standing and still get a little bit of resistance, but Blaydes is just kind of hurt enough at that point where, he's not able to find a finish on the feet, even though we've seen fairly limited ability from Almeida, I think, in that regard. I don't think most people are going to protest that, but again, the guy knows where his bread is buttered, and you want to bet on fighters that are not only consistently know where their effectiveness is, but have demonstrated the ability to get the fight to where they want it on their terms. We haven't seen Blaydes do that based on his most recent appearance against Pavlovich. We've seen Almeida do it multiple times against fighters that not only, offer this more of an advantage on the feet as what Blaydes is going to have here, but against fighters that presumably would want to keep it more of a striking match than what Blaydes perhaps needs to enjoy. So give me Jailton Almeida to win by submission. The next fight is Petr Yan and Song Yadong. Yan's on a 3-fight losing streak, entering 16-5 after previously being described as the best boxer in the UFC. Has lost 4 of his last 5 fights, albeit an incredibly impressive win in an interim title fight against Corey Sandhagen about 3 years ago. But since then has dropped a pair of split decisions, one to Aljamain Sterling, one to Sean O'Malley, and one to Merab Dvalishvili. And the consistent pattern of issues that we have seen in not only those 3 fights that he lost most recently, but even the win that he had over Sandhagen is something that I'm going to talk about, not only relative to his own problem, but also the problem, or a problem that Song Yadong has somewhat demonstrated in recent appearances in his own right. Yadong enters 21-7-1 with most recently a dominant win over Chris Gutierrez, and prior to that, a late knockout win over Ricky Simón, in which I think there were several unpenalized clashes of heads, and the second of which Yadong got a bit of a warning for headbutting, but really didn't face any scrutiny or penalty for, and still ended up getting a late finish over Ricky, but took the momentum in that fight after Ricky Simón took the first round with what was an unpenalized clash of heads that hurt Simón and clearly affected his performance for the rest of the fight. Prior to that, had a bit of a late start against Corey Sandhagen and got cut in the well, actually, I'm not necessarily sure if that was the case. He got cut in the second round against Sandhagen in what I think was probably a 19-19 fight at that point, but the cut was bad enough that they had to stop it at the end of the fourth round, and he, pretty clearly was dropping the third and fourth rounds after that happened. But in the problem with both of these guys that makes this fight, I think, very, very appropriately a pick'em, is that both of these guys have shown a desire to take the first round off in favor of making reads for the later rounds that they can then use to really, really assert their dominance, which is a good, I don't want to say good, but it can be an effective strategy for title fights and 5-round fights. But it's one of the main reasons that Jan lost a split decision to Aljamain Sterling when he could have, Sterling wasn't really able to get that fight consistently to the ground until the second round, in which he won outright of that fight. And it just makes you wonder that, especially against an opponent that he had been dominating in their previous matchup, if Peter Yan had been more forthright in getting his striking going earlier on rather than stalling out and just kind of opting to make reads, would he have still been champion coming out of that, and how different does his career look? The same thing was somewhat true in the fight with Sean O'Malley. I believe two of the judges ended up giving O'Malley the first round, and that ended up being the difference in that fight. All three of them gave O'Malley round 3, but Jan unanimously won the second round. And then Merab obviously just, put on a pace from the jump that Jan, in terms of, even though his takedown defense largely held up just relative to the amount of attempts, Merab's relentlessness was just too much for Jan to overcome in that regard. The interesting thing, I think, is that even though people were critical of Jan's takedown defense coming out of the Dvalishvili fight, he had 92% takedown defense prior to that, and his defense only dropped to 85% because of all the takedowns he defended in the Merab fight. So this guy really does still have elite, high-level takedown defense, to where I think you have to still like what he offers here. And Yadong isn't the most consistent in terms of takedowns from fight to fight. He averages only a little over more than half a takedown per 15 minutes. So you wonder if he's just going to opt to lean on striking for 15 minutes in a fight that's really only projected to go 3 rounds. I think this is a much more interesting fight if it's a 5-round fight, because, again, both of these guys have demonstrated that willingness to take the first round off to make reads. And it's especially interesting because Yadong, like I said, took that first round off against Ricky Simón, to where Simón was able to get the first round. Didn't really need to take the first round off against Gutierrez, just because Gutierrez didn't really have a more well-rounded game compared to, a wrestle boxer like Ricky Simón or Corey Sandhagen. But we saw Yadong kind of not get started very quickly against Kyler Phillips either, and that ended up being one of the reasons that he lost that fight 29-28, even though he was able to come on strong at the end. I think one of the key reasons he was able to beat Chito Vera in the fight prior to that is because Vera is someone who has also demonstrated to be a bit of a slow starter, and that was something where he was able to take advantage on his way to a unanimous decision. So I think this fight really, really is going to come down to which guy just spends less time making reads early and starting faster. And the track record for fighters that have lost 4 fights in a row in the UFC in terms of hanging around is not good at all, even though you don't expect Jan to get cut even if he loses this fight. But you have to imagine, based on the position in his career that he's at, that Jan is going to have a greater sense of urgency than what Yadong is going to have here, and I think is therefore going to be able to eke out at least the first round. It's possible that Yadong is able to implement his reads quickly and make the fight 19-19 going into the final round of this. And I do expect Yadong to take at least one of the later rounds here, but really what it's going to come down to is just which guy starts faster and is better at implementing their game plan. And you look at what the numbers are telling you here, and you see that Jan has the advantage, not only in terms of a slight edge in volume, but is more than 10% efficient in terms of landing his strikes. You have to like Jan coming out with a bit of a greater sense of urgency and also having the better potential to mix up the fight in a well-rounded manner based on the fact that he is nearly not quite tripling up Yadong on takedowns per 15 minutes, but at least is going to be able to have that option in his pocket more readily available than perhaps what Yadong would be able to implement, particularly given Jan has, even though both of them have shown pretty good takedown defense, Jan has a bit better in that regard than what Yadong has demonstrated if he decides to go that route. In terms of finishing upside, even though Yadong has more UFC finishes, Jan is a guy that's never been finished in MMA, period, so I think you kind of have to lean Jan just a little bit, even if you think Yadong might be a bit more of the harder hitter. And the other thing I think is that Jan has shown to be a bit better in terms of fights that go the distance, in spite of the fact that Yadong, really like the only decision that he's lost in the UFC was that Kyler Phillips fight in which he did unanimously win the 3rd round. So that's why I think that if you were to, I said I expect Yadong to win one of the later 2 rounds, I would say he's probably got a better shot at winning the 2nd round, and then Jan, just based on his boxing acumen, making reads on top of the reads that he had in the 1st round and taking the fight away down the stretch, and having a more well-rounded skill set available to him than what Yadong is going to be able to implement. So I'm taking Jan to win here, but again, it really is going to come down to which guy starts faster, because whoever ends up winning this 1st round, I think is just going to end up winning the fight, period. If Jan spends too much time making reads, as we saw, and was too willing to give up the 1st round against Sandhagen, and to a certain extent O'Malley, even though everybody that watched that fight will tell you that Petr Yan won, and even basing on Sean O'Malley's reaction between when the final horn sounded and when the result was actually read, he really did not look confident at all that he had done enough to win that. I don't know how you look at this and conclude that that Jan is going to comfortably be able to start fast. It's just the fact that Yadong has shown the same kind of hesitancy in terms of making reads. You wonder how active that 1st round is going to be, and therefore maybe a little bit more difficult to score. It's possible it's a situation where neither guy really ends up doing damage, and then Jan steals the round late with like a late takedown, and is able to hold on top there until the buzzer, to where it makes enough of an impression that it gives him the first. So I think there's plenty of reasons to like Jan here, but you got to just approach it with a sense of caution. But again, because he's on that 3-fight losing streak, I think that he's going to have a greater sense of urgency to start this fight faster than what we've seen in a lot of his most recent performances, particularly given that this isn't going to be a 5-round fight. So give me Petr Yan to win. I'll say it's by unanimous decision, but I do think it's going to be fairly close. And for that reason, even though I think there's good value here, I'm a little bit hesitant to lean on him as a parlay leg, but I might end up having to do it just given the way that a lot of these lines have drifted out this week. The next fight is Jack Della Maddalena and Gilbert Burns. JDM enters 16-2. Most recently picked up a split decision win over Kevin Holland at Noche UFC back in September of last year. In what was a fairly close fight, I picked Kevin Holland to win as, I believe, the underdog. A lot of people thought that fight shouldn't have been a split decision. I did think it was pretty close, but it was kind of weird in the sense that, both of them were throwing fairly a lot, but both guys were just kind of rolling off their strikes and not really doing a lot of damage to each other. It was a pretty weird fight. Prior to that, had a split decision win as well over Basil Hafez in a fight where he kind of got dominated on the ground, but was able to make enough of an impression in the stand-up against an opponent that was pretty outclassed in that respect that wasn't able to get it there. And I was listening to the MMA Oddsbreaker podcast with Adam Martin and Marcel Dorf this week, and Marcel very accurately pointed out that one thing that probably could have affected JDM in that matchup was the fact that he had to cut weight for a second time in as many weeks after he got rebooked after a cancellation the previous week for what I believe was UFC 294, or no, was it 291? Yeah, I believe it was, or 290. I think it was actually UFC 290 where he was supposed to be in Australia. His fight got canceled, and then he jumped on the fight night card at the Apex the next week, so had to do a bit of a double weight cut, and then against a guy that was going to try to implement a more well-rounded game plan than what JDM tends to be comfortable with, did get taken down and controlled, at least in the earlier stages of that fight, but was able to battle back and win, and demonstrated some good grit there. Conversely, Gilbert Burns we haven't seen for almost a year. I got to watch him retire Jorge Masvidal at UFC 287 in a fight that was plus odds to go over 2.5 rounds, and I thought that was kind of surprising given Masvidal hadn't really been knocked out by anybody other than Usman for quite some time, and the amount of decisions that both fighters had encountered in recent stages. Burns then took a quick turnaround about a month after that, a little under a month after that, in spite of the fact that I'm not sure if he had an injury going into it, but certainly seemed to at least get injured during the fight against Belal Muhammad and was able to survive to a decision, but really looked like he could have used some more time off than what he ended up having in preparation for that fight at UFC 288. So it's good that he's, taken time to recoup, but is now entering at a pretty old 37, especially given the amount of mileage he has on his body at this point, and JDM enters a full decade younger. So I understand why JDM is the favorite here, but looking at this fight, I think that there's a lot of reasons to like Gilbert Burns. I think that it's really, really hard to argue against JDM being the less well-rounded of the two here, particularly after the Basil Hafez result, in spite of the circumstances that I alluded to just a few moments ago surrounding JDM going into that one. Conversely, Burns, interestingly, is one of the only local guys on this card. And I think that it's going to be the rare time that you see the crowd firmly behind one fighter at UFC 299, because he's been very outwardly a South Florida guy for quite a while. I think it's one of the reasons why they felt comfortable scheduling him against Jorge Masvidal for 287, because that was going to be a South Florida matchup, in spite of the fact that it was figuring to be Masvidal's retirement fight. So this is going to be a rare spot where I think the first time in his career, at least, where Della Maddalena is not going to have the crowd firmly in his favor. And even though I would expect him to enjoy more moments of striking success, and he's shown relatively good or pretty good takedown defense in his career for 82%. He clearly is not going to be the more well-rounded guy coming into this. And if the thing that does concern me about Burns is, as I've spoken to in the past, as fighters that have had to lean on wrestling and ground game get up there in age, it becomes more and more difficult for them to implement that on a consistent basis. And it could be made more difficult by the fact that Burns has spent much more time away at this point in terms of a layoff than what we've seen from Della Maddalena. So I do think that there's a bit of ring rust concern here for Burns, but at plus odds, I think that there's enough reason to like Gilbert in terms of his ability to mix things up and get positive pop from the crowd when when he does have moments of effectiveness, that given the sheer amount of experience that he's had, even prior to moving up to welterweight, there's enough reason to like Burns here in spite of the massive age gap to where you can feel comfortable, I think, picking him. I think that he's probably going to be more well-suited to try to bank the first 2 rounds and then survive the third, because I don't expect him to be able to comfortably wrestle and put the fight on the ground for the opening, beyond the first 10 minutes. But if he's able to do that, I think he's going to be in a position where Della Maddalena is going to have to be kind of selling out for a finish late, and Burns is going to be able to protect himself to the point where, again, this guy's only been knocked out twice, and it's been from Dan Hooker and down at lightweight, and Kamaru Usman, who's one of the best ever for his weight class. And to that point, the only 3 fighters that have beaten Burns at welterweight are Usman and Khamzat Chimaev and Belal Muhammad. And even though Muhammad did it with only striking pretty much, there was those are 3 guys that very much have far more wrestling and grappling ability than what Della Maddalena has demonstrated to this point in his UFC career. And I think that there is a bit of a front-runner element for Della Maddalena, just given so much of his success has been first-round finishes, and the 2 most recent times we've seen him go to a decision, he's only been able to squeak out splits. So there's finishing upside, I think, certainly belongs to Della Maddalena here, which is why I can understand him being the favorite. But I think that the submission equity certainly belongs to Gilbert Burns, even though, outside of the Neil Magny win, the last time that we saw him win by submission was against Mike Davis in 2019. So, nearly 5 years ago now at this point. But in the Hafez fight, you saw enough of some concerns from Maddalena's ability to fight off of his back against a guy more willing to control him on the ground, that if Burns is able to get it there in the first round, I think that there is potential for a first-round submission. At that point, it's going to come down to, who's really able to win the second round, because I do expect Della Maddalena to have more striking success as the fight goes on, even though he's, a guy that, at least on volume, is already going to be doubling up Burns out of the gate. You just hope that Burns is healthy enough, and you figure that he is based on the fact that he's taken much more time to prepare for this than what we saw in the Belal Muhammad fight, that he's going to be able to have enough gas, even at 37 years old, to get the fight to the ground and put it in an area that's more conducive to what he needs to do in order to win it than what we've seen Jack Della Maddalena able to handle with, or what Burns was able to do most recently against Belal Muhammad. So give me Gilbert Burns. I'll say that he gets it done by 29-28 decision with the help of the loyal South Florida crowd, and snaps Jack Della Maddalena's 15-fight winning streak. The co-main event for UFC 299 is Benoit Saint-Denis and Dustin Poirier. Benoit enters 13-1 on a 5-fight winning streak. His only loss coming in his UFC debut up at welterweight against Oleksiejczuk dos Santos in a fight that infamously probably should not have gone to unanimous decision, and in which the referee in that one did not see any, was unassigned from any other fights that evening at UFC 267, and has not been back with the promotion since. Since then, Saint-Denis has shown remarkably blossoming skill set and has ripped off 5 finishes in a row, most recently against Matt Steamroller Frivola in unfriendly confines at UFC 295, in a fight that Frivola had the crowd behind him but was not able to take advantage. Saint-Denis actually very, very impressively, despite getting taken down and put on the ground in that one, had enough confidence in his ability to return to his feet and fight off of his back, where he was able to get up, and then in I believe the second exchange of them kind of separating as the fight returned to the feet, was able to capitalize on the opening and kick Frivola's lights out in very impressive fashion. In a similar fashion to how Dustin Poirier lost his most recent appearance, which was at UFC 291 last year in the BMF title fight, in which Poirier actually, me watching it live, I actually was worried, because I had actually thought that Gaethje had won the first round, but on 2 of the judges' scorecards, they actually gave the fight to Poirier, probably because there was a moment during the first where Gaethje was trying to blink out some damage. I don't know if that ended up making a bigger impression with the refs than anything else, because it seemed like Gaethje might have been just a smidge ahead on damaging volume. But a minute into the second round, Gaethje unloaded a head kick that Poirier, in spite of the fact that he checked one of them, a similar head kick earlier in the first round, did not quite get his guard up enough in time for that, and ended up getting put out cold in what was a remarkable flying in stoppage from Herb Dean, perhaps the finest of his career in that regard. I did more tape for this fight than any of the other ones because I have not had a lot of success with Benoit Saint-Denis since he came in. It certainly doesn't help that he lost his debut to Oleksiejczuk dos Santos. When he fought Nicholas Stolze, I took the +2.5 in that, thinking that Stolze might be able to stall it out to a decision a bit, but Stolze was, showed too much quit and ended up getting tapped out a minute and a half after really getting pieced up in the first round by Benoit. The fight after that, when he fought Gabriel Miranda, I actually don't remember how I ended up approaching that one. I hope that I didn't pick Miranda to win, but I do remember one of my greatest stayaways from last year was his fight with Ismail Bonfim, in which Bonfim was graded as a 300 favorite, which is a hilarious line in hindsight. And Saint-Denis really just totally turned the tables on Bonfim and submitted him in the first round. He then got a pretty favorable spot against Thiago Moises at Fight Night Gain Spivak in a card that I only had 4 fights graded on, and I parlayed, I think, all the other favorites that I had graded to win that night and still made profit, but took the other half of the units that I had available for my budget for that night and ripped a 4-leg that included Thiago Moises at plus odds. And that fight, I think, showed the key for why Benoit Saint-Denis is probably going to win this, because when I ran the film back on Poirier's last 3 fights against Oliveira and Chandler and Gaethje, the consistent problem that I noticed, not in the Gaethje fight, but certainly against Oliveira and Chandler, was that Poirier of late, and you notice this with a lot of fighters that are at least confident in their own skills, particularly their jiu-jitsu, The best way that you want to see fighters return to their feet when they've been put on their back is to go into butterfly guard and kick off the hips and create separation where they can stand back up, which is easier said than done. In a lot of cases, you'll see fighters kind of try to scoot back to the fence and then use the leverage of the fence to help bring themselves back up. But what you will see in a lot of other cases, especially for fighters that feel comfortable with their ability to attack a Kimura, is they will turn over and give their back and kind of use their ability to then push off from their knees rather than having to use explosion from their hips or create a hip escape to stand up in that regard and then fight the hands and break the lock. That can work against fighters that don't really have good jiu-jitsu acumen, but against fighters that have shown good ability to take advantage of fighters that give their back, that is not at all what you want to do and creates a lot of risk. And it's why, even though for fighters like Dustin Poirier that have shown excellent jiu-jitsu ability, I still count it against them in terms of their willingness to concede their back when they choose to do so. And the key thing that caused the separation that allowed Benoit Saint-Denis to get a late second round finish against Thiago Moises was Saint-Denis, instead of putting the fight on the ground consistently and, perhaps putting Moises in a position where he would have been comfortable to at least fight off his back and maybe lock up his guard his back, not the back triangle, but at least, I've spoken about fighters that kind of go guard goblin mode in terms of their, giving away around, which is exactly what Poirier did against Charles Oliveira in the second round of their title fight. Saint-Denis, rather than give Moises a better opportunity to defend himself on the ground, stopped really going after mat returns and just kind of held Moises's back in place and really just beat him up on the fence. And it was super impressive because you don't often see fight-ending sequences that happen on the fence, but Saint-Denis just recognized that Moises wasn't really able to escape the back control and wasn't really fighting his hands as much as he was trying to get out of when the fight got to the ground. And Saint-Denis just really put the pressure on him in a mounting way on the fence to where I think he's going to be able to do the same thing to Poirier if he wants to, just because Poirier's been too willing to give up his back, not only against Oliveira, but also Chandler. Now, the big thing and the main reason that I faded Saint-Denis so often, or at least shied away from betting his money line in the past, which is what I did it not only against Moises, but also Matt Frivola. And in both cases, I was taking guys that had plus odds available there, but the big thing, and the thing that still gives me pause even in this fight, is we just have not seen the guy win a fight by decision ever in the young stages of his MMA career. It just hasn't happened. The one time it's gone the distance, he lost to Oleksiejczuk dos Santos, and he has only seen the third round one other time in his career in what was his second MMA fight, in which he did pick up a rear naked choke victory. But again, that was against much lower level competition and in only the second appearance of his MMA career. So particularly in a fight that is slotted to go 5 rounds against a guy like Dustin Poirier that has been able to survive and implement game plans that have gotten him finishes uncharacteristically outside of the first round, you really, really wonder what this fight starts to look like the later it goes and how much Saint-Denis' cardio is going to hold up. But Poirier is getting, he is a much older 35 just given how long he's been around and how much UFC experience that he does have. But this is a guy who has been finished in all of I believe his last 5 losses, across the last 10 years. And in 2 of those cases got knocked out in the first round. And in two of those other cases was submitted in 5-round fights. And the finishing upside, I think, all the way has to belong to Saint-Denis here, given the guy's never been finished himself. and the two are just at very different stages of their career. I think Poirier is probably going to have the crowd advantage, just given he's a Florida-based guy. Even though he's a hometown Louisiana native, so there's a bit of a Southern connection there, I guess. But given that he's relocated to Florida, I think that he's pretty much going to have the crowd in his favor here relative to Saint-Denis. But Saint-Denis has just proven enough to be an action fighter and smart in terms of recognizing where he's having success and then leaning into that, as opposed to being all over the octagon. I understand why, even though I had Poirier graded as an underdog when I initially ran this, and then I decided that, especially given all the bad reads that I had on Saint-Denis lately, that I needed to run more tape on both these sides to just really get assurance of what the result was going to be. And that was where I picked up on the willingness for Poirier to concede and give up his back relative to the success Saint-Denis has demonstrated, even further away from using getting the back to implement a submission, more so his ability to hang on the back on the fence and still deal devastating damage to fighters that might otherwise show a little bit more resistance. So I think Saint-Denis should win here. I'm pretty upset that this fight overnight ballooned out to Saint-Denis being a 2-1 favorite, because I don't have that much confidence in him to win it. And I'm worried that I'm going to have to make this a stay away after all the work I did if that line with Benoit hangs out to where it is at this point. At that point, I would start to think that maybe looking at the plus 1.5 rounds is a little bit more enticing, especially because this is a 5-round fight. But at the same time, I really, really do think that Saint-Denis does deserve to be the favorite here and should win this, given the stages of the career that these guys are at. I wouldn't play Saint-Denis at greater than minus 200. But if the line does come down a little bit, which it kind of slowly has from where he was out to minus 225 on Monday morning, he's now down to 210. If you see him creep back into that like 190, 180 range, I think at that point you can feel good about playing Saint-Denis. And I would even look at potentially taking the plus 1.5 here, because if Poirier is able to get out of that first round, we've seen that he's a guy that can build to these later round finishes and drag fights out to decisions even after taking an insane amount of damage. And going into, fourth rounds, even losing 2-1 in some respects, is what happened in his battle with Dan Hooker. But I still expect Saint-Denis to get a finish here, which makes me a little bit hesitant to do the plus 1.5. I don't have the confidence to bet him at 2-1, so hopefully before I put the pick out, he comes down. But if you are able to get him inside that 2-1 range, lower than minus 200, or cheaper than minus 200, I think that you can feel pretty good about playing him. So give me Benoit Saint-Denis to win. And now we come to the main event. Sugar Show Sean O'Malley and Marlon Chito Vera 2. Sean O'Malley enters 17-1. He'll tell you he's undefeated, that he doesn't really recognize that injury loss that he picked up to Chito Vera the first time, but is coming off a underdog win over Aljamain Sterling at UFC 292, in which he knocked out Sterling in the first minute of the second round. Chito Vera's coming off the aforementioned unanimous decision win over Pedro Munhoz on the same card. UFC 292 was the second most profitable pay-per-view event I have ever had. At the start of this year, it was the most profitable, 49.5 units, and a big factor in that was me hitting a 4-leg parlay that was supported by Chito Vera's win over Pedro Munhoz, but that night was since then inflated by getting Sugar Show at 2-1 odds in a fight that I communicated on the RAXPOD, much in the same way that people talked about getting Makhachev at the price tag that he had when he fought Charles Oliveira, and that I then relayed in when Topuria fought Volkanovski at 298 last month. One of the things that you have to consider in terms of these young, very elite prospects being available at such plus odds price tags is, if they win the title, when do you think you're going to be able to bet them at that number again? And in both cases, I was able to have much more lucratively profitable nights than I would otherwise by leaning on the underdog to become the new UFC champion. And now you have seen that reflected in the fact that, in spite of the fact that Sean O'Malley is rematching the only fighter that has ever technically beaten him, he has since ballooned out to a 300 favorite. And thankfully, that number has come down at a lot of books, because I don't feel comfortable playing him out to the 300 range. But in a price tag between out to 200 and 300, I think that you can feel much better about that. There's certainly reason to be concerned here, just because Vera's already beaten O'Malley in a way that I think that he could still very easily take advantage of here, because we saw the volume of low leg kicks come back to bite O'Malley in the way that he lost that first round to Pedro Munhoz in a fight that ended up being a no contest, even though it felt like O'Malley was starting to take more of the momentum in that matchup as the second round proceeded on prior to the eye poke. The problem is, Chito is, as alluded to in the breakdown I gave with Jan and Yadong, has religiously been a guy that of late has been taking the first round off at the favor of making reads that he can then implement at the later stages of the fight. It's what happened against Pedro Munhoz. It happened against Corey Sandhagen, in which he let the fight totally get away from him. It certainly happened in the Dominic Cruz fight, in which he was on his way to losing a decision until he finally was able to take advantage of Cruz over, leaning on his, if not head feints, at least the way that he tries to dodge out and his crazy movement. And I remember directly saying, in terms of putting out the plus 4.5 rounds pick for that fight, the one thing you have to worry about is Cruz leaning too far into one of Chito Vera's kicks, and that's exactly what happened. And then even the Rob Font fight, he gave the first round away in that one too. And even though I haven't watched the Frankie Edgar fight in some time, I believe that the scorecards will also reflect that Chito Vera really gave away the first round of that fight as well to an opponent that was at a significantly older stage of his career in that regard. So because this is a 5-round fight, you can kind of forgive Chito Vera if he does decide to give away the first round in that respect in this one. But just based on a lot of what you've seen here, and Vera probably going to be needing to find a finish, I don't know if there's as many reasons to feel as optimistic about this one for Chito as there was when they were going into their first matchup, which I'm not sure what the line is, but I would have expected O'Malley probably to be a little bit favored, if out of nothing else than pure hype in that regard. If this fight does start going into the later rounds, we haven't seen O'Malley have to fight past round 3 in any of his events to this stage. We have no reason to doubt his cardio. He's shown very, very solid ability in all 4 of his fights in his career that have gone the distance to compete in the third round. 1 unanimous decisions in his first 3 that did so. And then even in the split decision win against Peter Yan, the reason it was an outright split was because he unanimously won the third round on the judges' scorecards. So I don't know if Chito's going to be able to weaponize cardio as much as he probably would like. The biggest path to victory is just going to be him really getting on the leg kicks early, and then that starting to take a toll on O'Malley as the fight gets into later and later rounds. which certainly could happen. But O'Malley's an older fighter at this stage than he was when he lost that first fight to Vera, 3.5 years ago now. And I think even though I don't really like his ability to find a finish in this one, I really like the comparison, because it was one I was going to make even before I listened to the podcast, that Adam Martin gave on the MMA Oddsbreaker show earlier this week, where he said this could end up proving to be a fight like O'Malley's fight with Chris Moutinho, where even though the guy is just showing an iron chin and really eating all of the damage, he's just completely out-pieced up in a way where he's just taking way too much visible damage and is in a really, really bad way the later and later that the fight goes on. I don't expect Chito to, show any let up. The guy has freakishly good cardio, which is one of the reasons that he's never been finished. I do think that if he's able to mix this fight up, that there's reason to consider that Vera might have some sort of ability to get a submission here, just because we really haven't seen that out of O'Malley in his UFC career, even though he averages just under half a submission attempt per 15 minutes. He has only one win by submission in his entire MMA career, and that was all the way back in 2015, nearly 9 years ago at this point. So that's why I don't feel good about betting O'Malley out to 300, is because even though I think he's got more of the knockout upside than Vera does, in spite of the fact that Vera got him on the finishes with legs, or by taking advantage of his legs rather, 3.5 years ago, still think you have to lean on, the more polished striking that O'Malley has demonstrated as he's come along, that he's going to be able to not only find a more comfortable path to victory through striking, regardless of whether it happens early, but also as the fight goes later on, in spite of Chito's really advanced cardio. But if this fight does hit the floor for whatever reason, I do think that there's some risk that Vera is able to make more of an impression than what O'Malley would be able to demonstrate down there. I would think that this fight goes to decision, just because Vera in many respects is too tough for his own good. I think that Vera is probably going to spend too much time making reads in the first round and in the earlier stages of the fight, to where he's not really able to even things out, where, perhaps he's able to get the fight on the ground in the second or third round and do enough damage from down there that O'Malley's got to respect that as they prepare to go into the later rounds. If we get to a case where Vera's not really consistently implementing this fight, getting to the ground, even though he figures to have a bit more of a well-rounded skill set, neither one of these guys are big on takedowns, and neither one of them are very efficient with their takedown attempts. O'Malley actually a little bit more so than Vera is. So if Vera, for pride or whatever, anything else, keeps this standing for longer than it needs to, I think that really only plays into what O'Malley wants in terms of finding a win here. I do think that Vera's going to survive to a decision here, but I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being something like a 49-46 for O'Malley, just because Vera's not able to get the fight consistently to the ground outside of maybe one round beyond the first round. And I think that O'Malley's pretty easily going to bank the first, just because of the hesitancy that Chito has shown, and he's not going to be able to implement the reads that he makes from the first round quick enough to even this fight out as it continues to go the distance. And O'Malley is probably just going to be able to coast if it does get to rounds 4 or 5, because he's comfortably banked the first 3 rounds. So give me Sean O'Malley to win by unanimous decision. Hopefully he stays within that 200 range, because I am probably going to have to lean on him in combination with some of the overs that I picked earlier this week for parlay success. And I think further than that, I'm probably going to have to hedge on one of either Petr Yan or Jailton Almeida as a more beefy, odds to get the parlay to where I want it to be, where I'm risking, 3 units to win 10 and then hedging on either Yan or Almeida to win their fight, hoping that both of them pull it out. But obviously there's different reasons why those fights are obviously lined as pretty close to pick 'em, if not right at that range as they are. And, I know Cutelaba is kind of available in a similar range, but again, there's enough risk, as I talked about before, where I'd rather play the under if that becomes available at similar odds. So I do want to lean on O'Malley as a parlay leg this week, but I don't think it's going to be, I'm going to be able to do it if it gets out to 300, just because Chito very much could make this fight interesting if he's able to get it to the ground consistently. But I just don't see it happening fast enough for him to, make this anything more than a comfortable bounce back for O'Malley. And it bears repeating, too, that I think part of the reason that the UFC was so willing to keep Vera in the title picture in the event O'Malley got a title is because O'Malley winning this fight even though I don't think it invalidates the first fight that these two had, it, at least in terms of legacy preservation and selling O'Malley as, a guy that would otherwise be undefeated and this budding megastar, him avenging the only loss of his career puts him into a position of not necessarily untouchability, but gives him a significant boost to his aura if he's able to avenge the only loss that he's had to this point in his career. So give me O'Malley to win by convincing decision, but it could be more interesting than a 300 favorite price tag on O'Malley would otherwise imply. And that's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 299. I know this was a pretty long one. I didn't even get to breaking down the pay-per-view itself until after 30 minutes in, but plenty to talk about in the interim relative to when I put out, the last couple of shows. So if you listen all the way to the end, as I always say, I'm super grateful and appreciative of that. Thank you very much. If you haven't already, please follow on Twitter, like, share, and subscribe on YouTube as often as you can. And, I wanted to get this one out earlier this week just because, it's finally on brand for, me to do a Miami show. And, you guys deserve it, I think. And I want to see this show do well, given the how successful of a pay-per-view I had last time. And the fact that going back to UFC 290, I am up 78 units on the last 9 pay-per-views. So I've had a lot of success on them of late. A couple bad breaks here and there. Obviously, Anjos Jubilee comes to mind at UFC 295. But hoping, obviously for another clean sweep at this one would be nice. Although I've got at least twice as many underdogs as I did at UFC 298, so that's going to be a tall order, and more than a few picks than I did for that one. I think I only had, what was it? I put out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 picks for that one, and we're going to have 9 for this one, and twice as many underdogs at least. So it should be an interesting card. Some very, very close, compelling spots on the main card. And, a couple of the prelims between Almeida Blaydes and Cutelaba Lins. And, some other fights that I think are probably going to be more fated to go to decision, but could be very interesting depending on what happens in the earlier rounds. But overall, I think that this card is absolutely worth the hype, and in some ways might even profile as a little bit better of a card than 300. But I think they really wanted to get the eyeballs on this one, given that they're trying to give O'Malley the cash cow boost by avenging the only loss that he's had previously in his MMA career and really establishing himself as a firm champion in his first title defense. I don't think I'm going to go. It's interesting that, After what happened in the main event of 287 last year, I'm never going to see a more significant moment in the history of MMA than Adesanya Pereira, especially if that proves to be the end of that rivalry and we don't end up ever getting to see the rematch at light heavyweight. The bar is just simply set too high from that, even though this card is, presumably more stacked than that one was. I had a lot of fun last year and I had such a great ticket, and the ticket prices are it's interesting. That event, I don't know if it's sold out, but it certainly didn't have as many issues with getting people to buy to go to that one that this one has. I think that over 50% of the tickets at the top of this week were still available, even though the prices were almost identical to what they were last year. And it really just goes to show you how crazily stacked that or how much a main event factors into an audience's willingness to purchase a ticket to an event relative to how stacked a card would be otherwise. It's shocking that for how many great fights are on this card, particularly going down to the prelims, that so many of the tickets are still available and that the market is kind of forcing the prices to come down. So if we get if we get to the point where, it's like Friday and we've still got maybe 25% of the inventory is still up for sale and the market has just crashed and they're trying to get people in, I might have to go buy a ticket at that point if I can go sit up top for something like $250 or $300. But there's no way that I'm going to see a better main event or even main event pay-per-view than what I got to enjoy at 287 last year. I had a perfect vantage point for one of the most significant moments, I think, in the history of MMA. And, I was also at UFC 274, and I got to see my favorite fighter get the submission of the year over Justin Gaethje in unfriendly confines and under obviously extremely dire circumstances, being the first champion to ever get stripped on the scale. So between those two events, I really have no desire to ever really pay out of pocket, or not pay out of pocket, but really pay an exorbitant fee to go see another UFC event. But if the market comes down on this one, as it kind of seems to be trending towards that direction, maybe I'll go scalp a ticket late. But if you are in the South Florida area, I would encourage you to go. If you haven't been to a UFC event before, it's certainly worth it. Last year was the first UFC event in Miami in nearly 20 years, so I think that was part of the spectacle too as well. So certainly some great fights to look forward to. But until they actually take place, thank you very much for tuning in. And I will be back for the you want to call it? I don't know, tricentennial is the right word, but UFC 300. You can look forward to me being back for that one. Unless we rip off another clean sweep at a pay-per-view this weekend. But fingers crossed and easier said than done. Thank you very much, folks. Take care and enjoy the fights.